Chapter 705. Li Yundong looked at Lu Chunping, who was dancing in front of him, and couldn't help frowning. Soon after the battle in Mount Koya, the Japanese cultivators had already discovered his identity and background as the reincarnation of Wisdom King. The battle just now had confirmed this point, making these Japanese fully understand. Don't use Buddhist magic and powerful magical weapons to attack me, otherwise you will be asking for trouble. It was precisely because they realized this in an instant that Pure Land True sect immediately chose to retreat collectively, so as to use their indignation to save the face of the sect. Although Takahashi Shota was a famous expert in the cultivation world of Japan, he was not the strongest in front of such a huge cultivation sect as Pure Land True sect. The suzerain of Pure Land True sect had not made a move yet, nor had their great monk Zhang appeared. As long as the strongest person did not appear, they would not fall too badly. They would not be completely defeated, and they would have an explanation when they went back. Although dozens of people from more than a dozen sects of the Pure Land True sect had evacuated collectively, there were still many Japanese masters on the field. Not to mention anything else, the great Onmyoji of the Abe family was an extremely difficult opponent to deal with. Deng Yu and Deng Jiao, who were on the sidelines, looked around curiously. They looked at Li Yundong and Abe, who were motionless, and then at Lu Chunping, who seemed to be possessed by a ghost. Deng Jiao, who was shy, couldn't help asking curiously, Shiji Lu Feng, why isn't Li Yundong moving? After the officials left, the cultivators of all sects on the field also calmed down. Their attention was once again attracted to the scene. Zhang Lufeng looked at Lu Chunping nervously and said in a low voice, Li Yundong is speculating what kind of illusion the other party is using and how to break it. Deng Yu smiled maliciously. Won't it be solved if we kill this guy? Zhang Lufeng turned her head and glared at her. How can we cultivators kill unarmed ordinary people? Deng Yu was scolded by her. She pouted and said, Who told this guy to be so annoying? Zhang Lufeng said in a low voice, No matter how annoying you are, you can't attack ordinary people. You must remember this. This is the iron law of our cultivators. Otherwise, you will suffer divine punishment. Deng Yu made an "oh" sound and said resentfully, Then, Senior Sister Lu Feng, how do we break this illusion? Isn't Li Yundong very powerful? Why hasn't there been any movement? Zhang Lufeng knew that they had only been cultivating for a short time and didn't know much about fighting, so she patiently explained, There are many kinds of illusions. There are many kinds of illusions in the cultivation world of Hua alone. Those who are most proficient in illusions are the fox spirits of the Fox Zen school, followed by the cultivators of Lu Guan Dao. In Japan, the Onmyoji were probably the most proficient in Genjutsu. Yin-yang masters have many types of illusions such as illusion technique, illusion technique, illusion technique, illusion spirit technique, illusion technique, and so on. There are more than 10 types of illusions, and every type of illusion has a different method of breaking it. If you fail to break it, then the person using the illusion will probably have to stay like this forever. Deng Yu was taken aback. Then what about this Lu something guy? Zhang Lufeng said helplessly. Then he can only accept his fate. However, it's a small matter that he has become a lunatic. But if this matter is spread out and the people above know about it, I'm afraid we will also be out of luck. This Japanese is up to no good. Deng Yu looked at Li Yundong eagerly, her hands clenched into fists, like a young girl praying. God bless Li Yundong. Let him pass this test smoothly. Li Yundong really wanted to pass the test smoothly now, but the illusion in front of him was really difficult for him to deal with. There are many types of Onmyoji in Japan, such as the Abe family, and the Abe family's mortal enemy, the Kamo family, and other sections. They all belong to the Japanese Shintoism, and the Yin-yang sect originated from the Warring States period of China. During the Warring States period, Zhou Yan and Zhou Shuang of the Qi Kingdom proposed the Yin-yang theory, which regarded yin and yang as two forces inside the body of all things. They believed that yin and yang were the source of all things in the world. This concept coincided with the idea of the founder of Taoism, Lao Tzu. Tao begets one begets two begets three begets all things. Therefore, Onmyoji had a strong Taoist imprint from the beginning. Taoism explained all things through the 5 elements of yin and yang, and Onmyoji happened to be the same. Therefore, the origin of all the magic of Onmyoji was actually similar to the magic of Taoism. The magic of Taoism was nothing more than the 5 elements, yin and yang, and the power of thunder. To generate a magic, It was natural to use the yin and yang qi and the 5 elements of qi in the body to drive the zhen qi, so as to use the 5 elements of heaven and earth to release the magic. In the same way, it was the same to crack the illusion. The source of the magic power of the illusion in front of him must be created through yin and yang and 5 elements. If he wanted to crack the illusion, he must understand the source of the opponent's magic power and the composition of the magic. Otherwise, if he cracked it rashly and failed, the consequences would be unimaginable. Although Li Yundong didn't like Lu Chunping, who was biased, he was even more unwilling to lose the battle in front of him. Li Yundong carefully looked at Lu Chunping in front of him. He was keenly aware that the facial features on Lu Chunping's face were significantly different from before. Before, Lu Chunping's nose was black and dry, the corners of his eyes were blue, and his lips were bright red like fire. At this time, the tip of his nose was shiny, and there was a faint brownish-blue qi coming out of his nose. There were even red spots in his eyes. Li Yundong knew that the Yellow Emperor's canon of internal medicine said, the nose is the organ of the lungs, the eyes are the organ of the liver, the mouth and lips are the organ of the spleen, the tongue is the organ of the heart, and the ears are the organ of the kidney. Before, Lu Chunping could see that there was a big problem with his 5 internal organs from the look, listen, ask and feel. The nose was black and dry, which was the result of excessive indulgence in sexual intercourse. Such a person's kidneys must be weak and premature ejaculation. The people with blue eyes mostly had liver problems, and the lips were bright red like fire, which meant that this person had heat poison in his body, and the yin deficiency and fire were strong. But at this time, Lu Chunping was abnormal. His face was red, the tip of his nose was black and dry, the corners of his eyes were blue, and his lips were bright red. This meant that the qi of the liver and kidney in Lu Chunping's body must be strong at this time. At this time, there was a brownish-blue qi coming out of his nose, and there were red spots in his eyes. This meant that there was something wrong with Lu Chunping's spleen, and his blood flow was not smooth. Li Yundong observed for a while. He had basically determined where the other party's illusion magic came from. From the observation of the 5 senses, he could judge the condition of the 5 internal organs, and from the condition of the 5 internal organs, he could infer the source of the mystery of the 5 elements magic. The heart, liver, spleen, lung, and kidney corresponded to the 5 elements of fire, wood, earth, metal, and water. At this time, Lu Chunping's liver and kidney were strong, which meant that the illusion Lu Chunping was suffering from must have been produced by the qi of wood and water. It was precisely because this magic was applied to Lu Chunping's body that his liver and kidney suddenly became strong for a while. As long as he took the right medicine, the other party's illusion would immediately be resolved. But at this time, Li Yundong was also keenly aware. He knew that since the other party was an outstanding yin-yang master, especially as the patriarch of the Abe family, he would definitely not use such a simple illusion to fight with him. Thinking of this, Li Yundong couldn't help but think of the time when he had just started to cultivate. Zi Yuan had taken out her 9th heaven Zi Yuan silk to show him and taught him about the dark fighting skills of magic weapon fighting for the first time. Zi Yuan's 9th heaven Zi Yuan silk had 3 different jinqi auras of yin, yang, and wood. At that time, Zi Yuan had relied on yin qi to entangle with him in the open, luring the enemy step by step. When he had been led to the hinterland, suddenly, the yang qi and wood qi of her magic weapon had rushed out at the same time, and he had been defeated. This matter had left a deep impression on Li Yunyang. It made him realize that fighting with methods is like using troops, and that fighting with magic was also the false is the real, and the real is the false. Could the result on Lu Chunping's face be true? Could it be a trap of the other party? The other party was a famous great yin-yang master. She wouldn't use such a simple illusion, would she? At this time, Li Yundong squinted at Lu Chunping, and his eyes fell on Lu Chunping's tongue. At this time, Lu Chunping was not only dancing, but also baring her teeth and claws. Li Yundong's sharp eyes saw at a glance that the tip of Lu Chunping's tongue was extremely thick, like a thick layer of cold white calluses. Li Yundong's heart suddenly moved. Of the 5 senses, the tongue corresponded to the heart of the 5 internal organs, and the heart corresponded to the 5 elements of fire. This meant that there must be something wrong with Lu Chunping's heart at this time, and there must be a cold yin qi lingering around it. At this time, Li Yundong's heart was calm. He concluded that the other party's magic must be a combination of yin qi, wood qi, and water qi. As long as he used yang qi, metal qi, and fire qi to attack Lu Chuanyuan's lungs and heart at the same time, he would definitely be able to break this illusion immediately. As soon as this thought flashed through Li Yundong's mind, he immediately pinched his fingers and bent them slightly. He quickly flicked Lu Chuanping's body 3 times in the air, one on the Shenfeng acupoint near his lungs, the other on the Tianqi acupoint near his heart, and the other on the Shenting acupoint on his forehead. The reason why the illusion could work on people was that the caster disturbed the normal qi of the 5 elements of the human body, thus causing the other party's 5 internal organs to be in disorder and qi and blood to be in disorder. This further caused the qi of the upper dantian in the brain to be in a mess, and he couldn't think like a normal person. Li Yundong's third flick had stabilized the chaotic qi in Lu Chuanping's brain. Lu Chunping, who had been dancing, suddenly seemed to have been immobilized. He stood there in a daze, motionless. In the eyes of the cultivators on the sidelines, Li Yundong was stunned for a long time. After he finally moved, he raised his hand and flicked his fingers 3 times, and Lu Chunping immediately quieted down. Some people with low cultivation quotients couldn't see the slightest mystery, while some cultivators with high cultivation quotients and high knowledge were full of praise. Su Yongzi nodded secretly on the side of the field and said, if Li Yundong won purely by strength, then it wouldn't be considered a skill. But in the blink of an eye, he was able to see through the mystery of his opponent's illusion and immediately counterattack. This is really outstanding and commendable. Mao Yuchong also secretly admired Li Yundong's reaction, but she still said unforgiving, how can it be so easy? If I were Abe, would I put all the flaws in front of you for you to see clearly? As soon as she finished speaking, Lu Chunping suddenly roared. His whole body trembled violently, beads of sweat rolling down his forehead, and 2 sharp horn-like hard objects slowly protruded from his forehead. His face turned blue and black, and his facial features became extremely ferocious, as if he was about to become a yaksha demon. The cultivators on the sidelines were all shocked. Li Yundong was also shocked, and his face was awe-inspiring. He thought to himself, what's going on? Did I fail to crack the illusion? No way. That's impossible. While Li Yundong was in shock, Abe, who was opposite him, suddenly smiled and said a few words in a loud voice. Sionji Tsunakatsu, who was on the sidelines, translated with some schadenfreude, Zhenren Li, if you think that our Abe family only has a few moves, then you are very wrong. Now, let me show you what a real great yin-yang master is. Chapter 706. Abe Yuji chose to fight with Li Yundong in illusions. He had witnessed Li Yundong defeat his opponents with terrifying power twice, so he knew that although his cultivation was not low, if he fought with Li Yundong head-on, it was very likely that he would be defeated. 9078. 8C3A4I6H507N8G67E9N8X0U2E30. 9C709M8. Moreover, as a yin-yang master, he was naturally good at summoning ghosts, but the other party was the reincarnation of Akalanatha. Wherever he stood, with his hands pinching the Akalanatha seal, the power emitted from his body was enough to deter any demons and ghosts. Not to mention controlling these ghosts to summon up the courage to attack Li Yundong. Even if he could barely control these ghosts to attack Li Yundong, he was afraid that they would be restrained by the power of Akalanatha. Knowing that it was impossible to do it, it was obviously not wise. Abe Yuji cleverly released 2 illusions on Lu Chunping. One was the Phantom Soul technique to control the other party's mind, and the other was the Phantom Soul technique to control the other party's body. Although illusions occupied the word phantom, as the name implied, these were all illusory illusions, but when the illusions were cultivated to the peak, they could also be made real. The Phantom Soul technique and the Phantom Soul technique used by Abe Yuji before could be said to be 2 opposite spells of the yin and yang 5 elements. If Li Yundong made a move against the Phantom Soul technique, the power of Xueqi would definitely enhance the power of the Phantom Soul technique. Similarly, if Li Yundong made a move against the Phantom Soul technique, it would enhance the power of the Phantom Soul technique. It could be said that the 2 illusions restrained and supported each other, complemented each other, and were a perfect combination of spells that could hardly be broken. In Abe Yuji's view, he wanted to fight with Li Yundong, not with strength, wisdom, not with courage. At present, he was obviously in an invincible position. Li Yundong didn't know it. Although he broke the Phantom Soul technique, his strength was like a new force, and immediately stimulated the Phantom Soul technique. Originally, the Phantom Soul technique could only make the person who was cast mistakenly think that he had become something. But how powerful was Li Yundong's Xueqi? As soon as his majestic qi entered Lu Chuanyuan's body, the illusion spell in his body suddenly became real, like rain after a long drought. His bones and body began to change shape. Li Yundong cracked one magic, but immediately activated another. The faces of the cultivators present turned pale for a moment. They knew that the illusion had become real, which meant that the magic was irreversible. Li Yundong had lost the battle, which meant that there were almost no powerful masters in the Chinese cultivation world who could stop these Japanese. This battle would end in a crushing defeat for the Chinese cultivation world. Worst of all, a living official had been turned into a monster. How was he going to explain this to the higher-ups? For a moment, the faces of Su Chan, Zi Yuan, and Zhou Qin were as pale as paper. Zhou Qin stammered, This is impossible. Master will never lose. Su Chan grabbed Zi Yuan's arm anxiously and kept shaking it. Sister Zi Yuan, what should we do? Was there any other way? Hurry up and think of a way. Zi Yuan bit her lips so hard that it almost bled. Her brows had never been so furrowed before, and her expression had never been as anxious as it was today. She couldn't help but send a voice transmission to Li Yundong. Li Yundong, winning or losing is a small matter. You can't let this guy become a monster. Otherwise, if this matter gets out, it will be a big disaster. Although Li Yundong was shocked and provoked by his opponent's words, he had fought countless battles since he had taken Renyuan Jindan, and his mind had long been extremely firm. The greater the pressure, the calmer he was. The more critical the situation was, the more he could turn the tide. At this time, when he heard Zi Yuan's words, his heart suddenly moved. He opened his eyes, raised his hand, and pulled out a few strands of hair from his head. With a shake of his wrist, like throwing gold needles, he pricked the hair in his hand into the arteries of Lu Chuanping's neck, chest, elbows and thighs. Lu Chuanping's body shook. These strands of hair were firmly stuck to his body like steel wires, and there was no sign of softening at all. The people on the sidelines saw this and were secretly shocked. Almost everyone on the field could throw their hair like needles, but Li Yundong, after throwing it out and pricking the opponent's body, could still be as hard as a steel needle, not softening at all. That was really a shocking ability. Deng Yu and Deng Jiao, the two rookies, were tongue-tied and asked, Is Li Yundong's hair made of steel wires? However, Zhang Lufang explained with a face full of awe, No, this is caused by Li Yundong's extremely strong and fierce zhenqi in it. Such a strong zhenqi attached to a strand of hair, if thrown out, can even pierce through a stone, but it didn't pierce through Lu Chunping. This is incredible. Li Wudi's grasp of strength, hardness, and gentleness had reached an exquisite level of perfection. Amazing, it's really amazing. Previously, Zi Yuan and Inspector Ono had fought in the way of spinning tops. Their control of strength had already been an eye-opener for everyone, but at this time, Li Yundong had shown his skill, which was even more exquisite than Zi Yuan's. But after Zhang Lufang sighed, she couldn't help but show a trace of regret and helplessness. Unfortunately, no matter how powerful he is, he can't reverse the situation. This game, we lost. At this time, not only Zhang Lufang, but everyone on the field thought that Li Yundong had lost the battle. The combination of magic that the opponent had used was really sinister and hidden to the extreme. Even if they were not convinced, they thought in their hearts, even if I were to go up, I'm afraid I would end up like Li Yundong. This magic can't be broken, unless Lu Chunping is killed. Otherwise, it can't be broken at all. But can Lu Chunping be killed? It's fine if he is a secular mortal, but he is also a high-ranking official in the system. As the saying goes, killing an official is equivalent to rebelling. If Li Yundong wanted to win, did he have to kill an official and rebel? However, Li Yundong immediately did something that left them dumbfounded. After Li Yundong threw out a few strands of hair and nailed a few holes in Lu Chuanping's veins, he immediately shouted and clapped his hands toward him. A majestic force slapped toward Lu Chunping like a mountain and overturning the sea. With a boom, Lu Chuanping's body suddenly shook violently, and a few columns of blood shot out from the places where his hair had been tied up like high-pressure water guns. Then, Li Yundong shouted at him angrily. This loud shout shook the sky, and everyone on the field was so shocked that their hearts beat violently and their qi and blood fluctuated. As cultivators, they were already like this on the sidelines, let alone Lu Chunping, who was the first to bear the brunt. Everyone saw that Lu Chuanping's body trembled as if he had been electrocuted, and then blood slowly flowed out of his 7 orifices. He had been killed by Li Yundong on the spot, and his body, which had become like a demon and a ghost, also returned to its original state little by little. For a moment, everyone was stunned. Even Abe Yuji looked at Li Yundong with a complicated look in his eyes. There was shock, admiration, and a faint trace of regret and sympathy. Li Yundong killed a secular mortal. Although he didn't use magic, he used the purest power of Xueqi, which was no different from using magic and magic treasures. The only criterion for judging the reason for the heavenly tribulation was whether it was directly killed by the power of Xueqi. Once it was determined that it was killed by the power of Xueqi, heaven would lock on this power, and then find the user of this power, and send the heavenly tribulation to punish him. All magic and magic treasures were directly activated by the power of Xueqi. Therefore, killing with magic and magic treasures would attract the heavenly tribulation, but in fact, killing with the power of Xueqi would also attract the heavenly tribulation. Moreover, if it was an ordinary secular person, it would be fine, but this person was still an official. In Abe Yuji's view, Li Yundong would definitely have a terrible disaster in the future, and it was even very likely that there would be no such person in the Chinese cultivation world from now on. Abe Yuji stared at Li Yundong for a long time, and then he slowly sighed and said, "I lost." As he said this, he slowly walked to the cultivators of various sects in Japan. He had a high reputation in the Japanese cultivation world. As soon as he returned to his side, someone came forward and comforted him. "Lord Abe, victory and defeat are common in the military. Don't worry about it." Saionji Tsunekatsu also smiled slightly and said, "Exactly. We also want to congratulate Lord Abe for removing this great enemy for our Japanese cultivation world." Abe sighed and said, "What's there to be happy about when you're prepared and when you're unprepared? It's an unfair victory. I'd rather everyone fight and learn from each other peacefully. There's no need to fight to the death." Chiyun, who had been silently watching the field, suddenly said, "In that case, Uncle Abe, why were you so insidious just now?" Abe Yuji said seriously, "Since I'm standing on the battlefield, how can I show mercy? Naturally, I have to do everything possible to knock down the strong enemy in front of me." Guang laughed and clapped his hands. "Well said, well said. This is the great Yin Yang master of our Japanese cultivation world." Hearing this, Chiyun seemed to be deep in thought. He looked at Li Yundong with flickering eyes and said in a low voice, "Unfortunately, I can't fight with him." Although the Japanese cultivation world had lost this battle, everyone was happy because they knew that Li Yundong would be in big trouble in the future. The people of China would get rid of this terrible opponent for them. Although the Chinese cultivation world had won, many people looked as if they had lost their parents. Su Chan, Zhou Qin, and Zi Yuan's faces changed dramatically. Zhou Qin was extremely strong-willed, but at this time, she couldn't help but be dazzled. She was so shocked that her body was almost on the verge of collapse. Su Chan's body was almost soft. If it weren't for her master Ao Wushuang supporting her, she would have fallen to the ground in fear. Zi Yuan was the only one who could barely hold on. Her beautiful red lips had been bitten by herself, but she didn't know it. She was just thinking quickly about how to help Li Yundong deal with this disaster. But just as they were panicking, Li Yundong showed a crafty smile at the corner of his mouth. He walked slowly to Lu Chunping, reached out his hand, and pressed it gently on his chest. Then, his fingers quickly swept across his body, and a few strands of hair that had been stuck on his body before were taken off. Seeing his actions, everyone sighed inwardly. However, someone with sharp eyes suddenly saw that Lu Chunping actually let out a long sigh, and his chest began to rise and fall again. At this moment, everyone's eyeballs almost popped out of their sockets. Saionji Tsunekatsu was so scared that he took a step back. As if he had seen a ghost, he stammered, This is impossible? He's not dead?" Abe couldn't believe his eyes. He stared at Lu Chunping with his eyes wide open. His mouth was wide open, and he couldn't react for a moment. Guang was stunned for a moment, and then there was a flash of light in his eyes. He clapped his hands and couldn't help shouting, "Wonderful, it's really wonderful. Putting oneself on the brink of death and coming back to life, it's too wonderful for words." Chapter 707. After hearing Xueqi's words, not only did other people in the Japanese cultivation world understand, but many people in the Chinese cultivation world also understood. Zhang Lufang was so excited that her pretty face turned red, and her eyes were full of worship and admiration as she looked at Li Yundong. Although Deng Yu and Deng Jiao were surprised that the dead Lu Chunping had come back to life and that Li Yundong had escaped, they couldn't understand why Lu Chunping could come back to life. Deng Yu couldn't help but ask, Shiji Lu Feng, isn't this Lu Chunping dead? How did he come back to life? Zhang Lu Feng was so excited that she could hardly control herself. She said quickly, you idiot, that was Li Yundong's trick. Abe was right. Li Yundong was also good at scheming and trickery. Think about it, in that situation at that time, did you also think that only by killing Lu Chunping could we break the magic of this Japanese? Deng Yu and Deng Jiao, this pair of beautiful sisters, widened their eyes and nodded at the same time, like two chicks pecking rice. Zhang Lufeng laughed and said, by the way, I thought the same at that time, and I believe that everyone present thought the same. Li Yundong must have thought the same at that time, so he simply played along with us and tried to shock Lu Chunping to death with a loud shout. And his loud shout could really shock Lu Chunping to death. Not to mention him, I'm afraid that if I were in his position, I would also be shocked to death by Li Yundong. Deng Yu quickly asked, then why didn't Lu Chunping die? Zhang Lufeng said with a smile, have you forgotten that Li Yundong pierced his opponent's artery with his hair? This is equivalent to poking a few holes in his opponent's body. Didn't you see that when Li Yundong shouted, blood gushed out of these holes? If it weren't for these holes, the qi and blood in Lu Chunping's body would have been shaken back and forth by Li Yundong's loud shout, and he would have been shocked to death. Think about it, why do we have to open our mouths when we hear a loud sound? It's to reduce the damage caused by the echo shock to the body. Deng Yu was a little confused, but her sister, Deng Jiao, had already understood. She looked at Li Yundong in disbelief and murmured, oh my god, just listening to it makes me feel complicated. How did he think of this at such a critical moment? Zhang Lufeng also looked at Li Yundong with great admiration and said with a look of infatuation, why don't we all say that he is super Li? This kind of reaction, this kind of wit, this kind of boldness, is truly worthy of the two words invincible. Deng Yu couldn't help saying, but isn't Lu Chunping bleeding from her 7 apertures? Zhang Lufeng giggled. Who says bleeding from the 7 apertures means death? Li Yundong's roar shook Lu Chunping's qi and blood, making it want to rush out, but it couldn't get out from other places, so it could only rush out from the 7 apertures and the wound that Li Yundong had pierced before. So when we saw him bleeding from the 7 apertures, we thought he was dead. In fact, we were all fooled. Deng Yu was still a little puzzled and asked, then why did Li Yundong press on this guy's body just now? Zhang Lufeng laughed and said, you're so stupid. Li Yundong's roar was very powerful. We were all shaken to the point that our qi and blood were unstable. Lu Chunping is just a mortal. His heart must have suddenly stopped beating and he went into shock. Li Yundong just pressed on his chest and stimulated his 5 internal organs with zhenqi, so he came back to life in a flash. Only then did Deng Yu understand. She patted her chest and said, amazing, amazing. I can't imagine that such a master is my classmate. Oh my god, if I go down the mountain and tell my classmates, I'm afraid they'll think I'm telling a fairy tale. He really deserves to be my idol. He's amazing. The juniors of the cultivation world were chattering on one side, and they were able to describe the situation on the field. Su Chan, Zi Yuan, Zhou Qin, and the others felt as if they had gone from hell to heaven. They had taken a roller coaster ride, and they had gone from horror to ecstasy and excitement. Su Chan had been so scared by Li Yundong that she thought she would be forced to separate from him again. For a moment, tears welled up in her eyes. She was afraid that others would laugh at her, so she held back her tears. But at this time, when she saw that Li Yundong had saved a guy who everyone thought was dead in an instant, she immediately burst into tears of joy, and tears fell down. Su Chan wiped her tears and smiled like a flower. She said in a low voice, you're so annoying. You only know how to scare me. Ao Wushuang looked at Li Yunyang with emotion in her eyes and said in a low voice, you can summon clouds with one hand and rain with another. Good skill, good skill. Li Yundong stood up in the midst of the exclamations of admiration. His face was indifferent, as if he had done something very ordinary. He glanced at Lu Chunping and knew that although the guy in front of him had come back to life, the qi and blood in his body were still chaotic. He couldn't move him easily, so he let him stand on the field like a wooden stake. Li Yundong cupped his hands to the cultivators of the Japanese sex and said in a clear voice, who else wants to come up and teach me? At this time, Li Yundong had won consecutive battles. In the first round, his methods were fierce and violent, which was awe-inspiring. In the second round, he was witty and full of courage, which really opened the eyes of the cultivators of all sects and amazed them. At this time, no matter how unconvinced they were, they couldn't help cheering for Li Yundong on the sidelines. For a moment, the sound on the side peak of Mount Longhu was like thunder, and the applause was endless. The cultivators of the Japanese sects looked at each other with awe in their eyes. Saionji Tsunekatsu's face was solemn. He turned around and said to Isi Shunguang in a low voice, "Shunguang Jun, it's a critical moment now. We must defeat this guy. Otherwise, the humiliation of the Battle of Mount Koya will reappear in front of us." Although Isi Shunguang appreciated Li Yundong's wisdom and courage very much, he also knew that the battle in front of him was no small matter. They couldn't afford to lose. After thinking for a while, he raised his head and said, "This person is the reincarnation of Wisdom King. His spiritual energy is strong and he is full of wisdom. I don't have any good way to deal with him." Isi Shunguang was a famous sage in the Japanese cultivation world, and his cultivation was outstanding. When he said this, many Japanese cultivators next to him were shocked. Saionji Tsunekatsu was shocked and cried out, "Are we going to stop here?" Isi Chuyun raised her eyebrows and was about to step forward to speak, but as soon as she moved, she was immediately stopped by Isi Shunguang's gaze. Although she was puzzled, she still stopped and looked at the field hesitantly. While she was hesitating for a while, an old voice called out the name of Buddha and said, "Amitabha. In that case, let me go." The Japanese cultivators turned their heads and saw an old monk with gray eyebrows putting his palms together and slowly walking forward. It was Imagawa Kagumo, the leader of the Tiantai sect. Several cultivators of the Tiantai sect immediately said anxiously, "Master, you haven't recovered from your injury. You can't go on stage." Imagawa Kagumo lowered his eyes and said slowly, "If I don't go to hell, who will?" Next to him, a monk who looked to be in his 40s tugged at his robe tightly and shouted, "Master, your injury. You can't withstand such a fierce battle anymore. If anything happens to you, who will lead us to seal the mystical silver fox?" "Master, let me go." Imagawa Kagumo looked at the monk beside him and smiled slightly. "You, Hideyoshi, Li Yunyang is not an ordinary person. Unless your cultivation is higher than his, you will definitely be restrained by the power of his Wisdom King. Your cultivation is not much different from that of Zhanren Li. If you go on stage, you will definitely lose. Don't worry, since I'm going on stage, I have the confidence to win. Although the power of Wisdom King is powerful, it's not invincible. I have a way to defeat him." As he spoke, he whispered a few words in Hideyoshi's ear. When the monk named Hideyoshi heard his words, he couldn't help but let go of his hand and sit down cross-legged on the ground. He put his palms together and said, "Master, we'll wait for you here." Then the other monks of the Tiantai sect also sat down cross-legged, put their palms together, and said in unison, "Master, we wish you victory." Imagawa Kagumo chuckled and gently stroked their heads with his hand. Then, he flicked his sleeves and stepped into the field. Imagawa Kagumo was a famous eminent monk in the Japanese cultivation world. Whether it was the study of Buddhist scriptures, Dharma, or his own cultivation, he had reached an astonishing height. Even many people in the Chinese cultivation world knew his name. Zi Yuan was slightly shocked. She widened her eyes and said, "Imagawa Kagumo? He's actually going on stage." Zhou Qin looked at her in confusion. "Is this old monk very famous?" Zi Yuan's face was solemn, and her expression was even more serious than when Abe had a reason to go on stage. "This is the master of the Tiantai sect." Zhou Qin laughed. "Master, didn't you defeat the masters of the Shinto path of the Pure Land sect and the Earth Imperial sect? One of them is even the patriarch of the Abe family. This master of the Tiantai sect must be no problem." However, Zi Yuan shook her head and said, "No, this Imagawa Kagumo is a master at the level of Thunder Retribution." A master at the level of Thunder Retribution? Zhou Qin, Su Chan, and Ruan Hongling exclaimed in unison. They fixed their eyes on the old monk in the field, only to see that the old monk was quite short and skinny. Half of the loose monk robe he was wearing was almost dragging on the ground, as if he was dragging a long red dress. They muttered to themselves, "This skinny guy who can be blown away by a gust of wind is actually a master at the level of Thunder Retribution?" They had only heard of this master at the level of Thunder Retribution, but they had never seen him. Just how powerful is a master at the level of thunder retribution? Can Li Yundong beat a master at the level of thunder retribution? Li Yundong's eyes were fixed on Imagawa Kagumo in front of him. He was keenly aware that although his opponent was skinny, his eyes were bright and he could not be underestimated. He bowed slightly and said, "I haven't asked for your name yet." Imagawa Kagumo also put his palms together and bowed. He said very politely in standard Chinese, "I'm Imagawa Kagumo, please give me some pointers." As he said that, he didn't care about the dirt on the ground and sat down cross-legged. Then he pointed at the floor and said with a smile, "World's honored one, why don't we sit down and discuss Taoism and fight face to face?" Although he didn't know what the other party was up to, he was confident that his cultivation was high and his means were excellent. He didn't care what the other party was up to. As long as he could do whatever he wanted, he would let him do whatever he wanted. Just let him do whatever he wanted. Li Yundong smiled slightly and also sat down cross-legged. He put his palms together and asked, "How does Imagawa Kagumo want to fight?" Imagawa Kagumo smiled mysteriously and took out a wooden fish from his wide sleeve. He smiled and said, "I want to compete with you in chanting. What do you think?" Li Yundong couldn't help but laugh. He couldn't believe his ears. This old monk wants to compete with me in chanting? Is he bullying me because I'm young and haven't read as many books as him? Are you kidding me? The scriptures I've read in the spirit space are probably more than the books you've read. Li Yundong smiled happily and said, "All right, let's compete in chanting then." Imagawa Kagumo saw that Li Yundong had agreed and laughed. He praised, "World's honored one is really bold. I admire you." The two of them were talking seriously, but the people around them didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Some Chinese cultivators laughed loudly and said, "Hey, old monk, are you guys out of tricks? You're actually competing in chanting. I'm dying of laughter." That's right, who doesn't know how to chant scriptures? How are we going to compete in chanting scriptures? See who can chant more fluently? You're so silly. Let's see who can chant until their mouth gets dry. The one who can chant until their saliva runs dry will naturally win. Huh? Then if their saliva doesn't run dry, won't they keep chanting? Won't we have to wait until the end of time? Hee hee, how can that be? Even the yellow river will stop flowing, let alone saliva. But just as they were discussing, Imagawa Kagumo raised his hand and took out a small mallet from his sleeve. He hit the wooden fish with a thud and started chanting the Dharma Sutra in a serious manner. This sound was originally ordinary, but in an instant, the sky suddenly darkened. A large mass of dark clouds quickly gathered in the sky above the side peak of Mount Longhu from all directions. Everyone looked up and saw thunder and lightning rolling in the clouds. Their expressions changed drastically. Only then did they understand what Imagawa Kagumo was trying to do. For a moment, everyone looked at Imagawa Kagumo in shock. Was this old monk going to chant in the midst of the thunder? It couldn't be, right? Was he crazy? Li Yundong's expression also changed. He looked up at the dark clouds in the sky and thought to himself, "He really is a master of the thunder retribution. He can summon the thunder without making a sound. Amazing." Li Yundong's eyes flashed as he looked at Imagawa Kagumo. He saw that the old monk had his eyes closed, as if he was meditating. One of his hands was placed in front of his chest, while the other hand was lightly hitting the wooden fish. He was chanting in a low voice, "Impermanence is the law of life and death. Life and death destroy oneself. Nirvana is joy." This was the scripture from the Mahavira Nirvana Sutra. As soon as he finished reciting the scripture, there was a loud bang in the sky. Countless bolts of heavenly thunder suddenly struck down on the dojo. The lightning was dazzling, and the electric light was flying. In an instant, Li Yundong and Imagawa Kagumo were engulfed. Chapter 708. The power of the heavenly thunder was so great that it made one's hair stand on end. The power of the heavenly thunder that Imagawa Kagumo had mobilized was so great that it made one's hair stand on end. The moment the heavenly thunder fell, all the hair on Li Yundong's body stood up. The yang spirit in his body suddenly rose into the air, leaped to a place more than 10 meters above his head, and rushed straight toward the heavenly thunder. It was not that Li Yundong wanted to fight the opponent head-on, but when the heavenly thunder struck, he could either dodge it, hide under the protection of a top-notch magic treasure to avoid it, or use the yang spirit to resist it. There was no other way. Although Li Yundong was proficient in all kinds of five elements magic, no matter how strong the five elements magic was, it was naturally restrained by the heavenly thunder. The power of the heavenly thunder was above any magic. The Samadhi true fire was known to be able to burn everything, and the power of the nine thunder magic was even greater than it, let alone the heavenly thunder that was even more powerful than the nine thunder. When a bolt of heavenly thunder fell, no matter how strong his body was, it could not withstand it. Even if he used his jinshin to protect his body, if the heavenly thunder struck him, even if he did not die, he would be half dead. Back then, Su Ling had been so arrogant on the Tiandu peak of Mount Huangshan, but when a bolt of heavenly thunder struck him, his body and soul were almost destroyed. Even his jinshin could not protect him. Although Li Yundong had cultivated to the realm of immortal jinshin, he did not dare to use his body to test the power of the heavenly thunder. As soon as his young spirit rose into the air, Imagawa Kagumo, who was opposite him, also rose into the air and headed toward the heavenly thunder. Imagawa Kagumo's young spirit rose into the air, but it was a solemn bodhisattva sitting on the lotus throne. Beside the lotus throne, there were lotus flowers with crystal-clear seeds. This bodhisattva was wearing a golden gauze red robe, her chest was bare, and her hands were holding the Sakyamuni Buddha seal. Behind her head was a colorful halo, and above the halo were 7 colorful peacock feathers. With a loud bang, Li Yundong and Imagawa Kagumo's young spirit collided with the heavenly thunder and immediately trembled. Li Yundong's young spirit was instantly torn into pieces and shattered into countless golden clones. Imagawa Kagumo's young spirit made a big handprint in his hand and blasted it toward the heavenly thunder. As soon as the two came into contact, the handprint was shattered by the heavenly thunder, and the power of the heavenly thunder was greatly reduced. When it hit Imagawa Kagumo again, his young spirit only moved a little, and the lotus beside the lotus throne trembled slightly. Su Chan and the others on the sidelines saw that Li Yundong's young spirit had been shattered in the blink of an eye, and they immediately cried out in fear. Su Chan said anxiously to Ao Wushuang, "Master, can Li Yundong win? This is heavenly thunder." Ao Wushuang's expression was serious. She watched the terrible heavenly thunder fall one by one with fear, but she comforted her, "Don't worry. Didn't Li Yundong go through the heavenly tribulation once? This shouldn't be a problem for him." Hearing this, Su Chan felt a little relieved, but Wan Hongling, who was beside her, was furious. She suddenly said loudly, "Li Yundong didn't go through the heavenly tribulation alone. Without my Shiji Zi Yuan's help, how could he have gone through it? If it weren't for helping him, our Linggong sect would." Before she could finish her words, Zi Yuan suddenly turned her head and shouted at her, "Hongling, is this the time to say such things?" Wan Hongling was frightened by her words and immediately shut up. She looked at the field resentfully. Su Chan looked at Wan Hongling in confusion. She didn't know what she meant, but Ao Wushuang's heart skipped a beat. She looked at Zi Yuan with sparkling eyes and thought, could it be that the Tong Tian glass mirror and the purple gold luo jade plate in Zi Yuan's hands were broken because of Li Yundong? Well, it's possible. No wonder Zi Yuan refused to admit it at the inauguration ceremony. It turned out to be like this. Ao Wushuang guessed in her heart, but she didn't say it out loud. She temporarily suppressed this matter in her heart. Just as they were talking, Zhou Qin suddenly pointed to the sky and said in surprise, "Look!" Everyone looked up and saw that Li Yundong's shattered golden body had gathered together in an instant, turning into an immovable wisdom king. What was different from before was that Li Yundong was holding a Vajra wisdom sword and trying his best to chop at the heavenly thunder above his head. Su Chan was overjoyed and said, "Ah, Yundong's young spirit has recovered again. It's amazing." As soon as she finished speaking, Li Yundong's young spirit was instantly smashed into pieces. The smile on Su Chan's face froze. Before she had time to worry, she saw Li Yundong's young spirit return to its original state in an instant. The process repeated. She blinked a few times, and Li Yundong was smashed and restored several times. Su Chan turned to Ao Wushuang with a depressed face and said, "Master, what's going on?" Ao Wushuang stroked her head dotingly and shook her head. "You little girl, you don't usually cultivate well. Now that you see such an earth-shattering battle, you don't even know what's going on. You really want to piss me off. After all, you're a 7-tailed fox spirit. How can your knowledge be so poor?" Su Chan blushed and said in a low voice, I'm not ashamed to ask, am I?" Ao Wushuang was so angry that she laughed. Well, you're not ashamed to ask. I can't afford to be asked like this. Su-chan made a face at her and said, if you don't tell me, I'll ask Sister Ziyuan. As she said this, she took Ziyuan's hand and asked, Sister Ziyuan, you must know, right? Ziyuan smiled slightly and said, Li Yundong is in the Jinshin phase. This is what happens when he fights against the Thunder Retribution with his Jinshin. Fortunately, Li Yundong has already comprehended the unity of heaven and man, the 10,000 methods returning to the origin, and the infinite void. Even if the Jinshin is smashed into countless pieces, as long as the true method is still there, his Jinshin can be restored in an instant. Su-chan suddenly understood and said, Ah, isn't that similar to crossing the Thunder Retribution? Then, can Yundong absorb the power of heavenly thunder while crossing the Thunder Retribution? Ziyuan shook her head and said, It's still winter. The winter thunder has no vitality at all, and he can't absorb any power. Only crossing the spring thunder is the best time. Su-chan patted her head in annoyance and muttered, Yes, I knew all this before. Now that I've been with you for too long, I've become stupid. Her words made Zhou Qin, Ziyuan, and the others laugh, and the tense and solemn atmosphere of the heavenly thunder had been diluted a lot. They spoke casually, but the people on the sidelines were extremely serious and nervous. They knew that if the two of them could not resist the lightning, it was very likely that they would be affected by it. They would immediately have to run for their lives in all directions, like it's thundering, it's raining, everyone, put away your clothes. Everyone saw dark clouds rolling above their heads and thunder bursting. A wisdom king was broken and restored under the fierce bombardment of the heavenly thunder, and then broken again. The cycle was simply too much for the eyes to take in. On the other side, a bodhisattva was holding all kinds of Taoist seals in his hands in the thunder, remaining motionless. Looking from afar, the side peak of Mount Longhu was flowing with rich brilliance under the fluctuations of these two powerful forces. In the shroud of dark clouds, no one could tell what color they were. Maybe it was red, maybe it was yellow, maybe it was white, maybe it was black. All kinds of colors were intertwined, struggling and moving. Sometimes they scattered like a rainbow falling from the sky, and sometimes they gathered like a rolling python. It was really a fierce battle. Many of the tourists on the main peak of Mount Longhu were dumbfounded when they saw this scene. They stopped in their tracks and looked in the direction of the side peak. Deng Yu and Deng Jiao naturally hoped that Li Yundong could win with overwhelming strength again, but they saw that Li Yundong was actually at a disadvantage at this time. His yang spirit was constantly being split apart, while Jin Chuan Xingyun was coping with it with ease. Moreover, although Li Yundong's body was also sitting cross-legged at this time, his expression was solemn and his eyebrows were tightly furrowed. Jin Chuan Xingyun was sitting cross-legged on the ground, chanting scriptures while using his yang spirit to resist the heavenly thunder. His expression was calm. Deng Yu couldn't help but say anxiously, The situation doesn't look good. Zhang Kongyun's eyes were fixed on the field. He sighed and said, As expected of the leader of the Tiantai sect, as expected of a master of lightning retribution. He can calmly recite scriptures in the heavenly thunder without being disturbed at all, and at the same time, he can control the yang spirit to resist the heavenly thunder. This kind of calmness in the face of the heavenly thunder, this kind of cultivation that treats the heavenly thunder as nothing, is really terrifying. Deng Jiao was more attentive. She looked at the bodhisattva transformed from Jin Chuan Xingyun's yang spirit and asked in a low voice, What kind of god is this? Why is it so powerful? Zhang Kongyun said in a deep voice, This is the Dragon Tree Bodhisattva. Deng Yu and Deng Jiao were confused and said in unison, Dragon Tree Bodhisattva? What kind of bodhisattva is this? Why haven't I heard of it? Zhang Kongyun nodded. Just as he was about to speak, Zhang Lufang, who was beside him, said, Oh, you two rookies, don't you know the Dragon Tree Bodhisattva? This is the greatest Buddha after Gautama Buddha. In the history of Indian Buddhism, he is known as the second-generation Gautama Buddha. His status in Buddhism is equivalent to the status of the second sage of Mencius in Confucianism. The 8 major sects of Buddhism in the Central Plains all recognize the Dragon Tree Bodhisattva as the ancestor. Deng Jiao was surprised when she heard this, but Deng Yu didn't care about this. In her opinion, no matter how great this Japanese bodhisattva was, it was an evil bodhisattva. It was a bad bodhisattva. She made a face and said, Humph, no matter how powerful he is, he's still a bad guy. This Dragon Tree Bodhisattva doesn't seem to be a good thing either. Zhang Kongyun laughed and shook his head. Don't talk nonsense. This is just the dragon tree bodhisattva transformed by Imagawa Kongyun, not the real bodhisattva. Moreover, although the dragon tree bodhisattva had many misdeeds when he was young, such as sneaking into the palace with his friends to molest the palace maids, after being discovered, all his friends were beheaded, and he was the only one who survived. After this incident, the dragon tree bodhisattva suddenly repented and entered Buddhism, achieving the supreme Dharma. As the saying goes, the prodigal son repents and becomes a Buddha on the spot. Although I am a Taoist cultivator, I also respect the dragon tree very much. You can't be disrespectful to this bodhisattva. They whispered to each other. At this time, Li Yundong had slowly figured out the trick of resisting the heavenly thunder. In the process of his Jin Shenyang spirit being smashed again and again, Li Yundong clearly felt that it was impossible to resist the power of the heavenly thunder with the power of his Jinshin alone. He had to rely on the power of heaven and earth to resist it. When he was practicing the Vajra longevity skill, he had comprehended the Wuji realm of unity of heaven and man. The moment his Yang spirit was smashed, it split into thousands of clones. Each clone absorbed the chi of heaven and earth and then gathered together. Mount Longhu was a famous place of Lingqi in the world. It was the creation of heaven and earth, the beauty of all living things, and the Lingqi was so heavy that there was no second place in the world. Every time Li Yundong was smashed, the Lingqi he absorbed would increase. Although he was constantly being smashed, his Jinshin was getting stronger and stronger. Everyone saw that Li Yundong's Yang spirit was greenish-black with blue flames flowing around it. Two completely different breaths came out of his nostrils. One was red, and the other was black. He looked angry and ferocious, extremely terrifying. From the beginning, when the Jinshin was smashed, Li Yundong was slowly able to resist the heavenly thunder with the Mahamudra without the Jinshin being smashed. It seemed to take a long time, but in fact, it was only a matter of 2 or 3 minutes. Imagawa Kagumo saw that Li Yundong was slowly standing firm in the heavenly thunder. He frowned slightly and made a finger seal. The Yang spirit chanted a mantra and a Mahamudra Kung Fu slapped toward Li Yundong. Li Yundong looked over and saw that the other party's hands were tied outside. His middle fingers were put together vertically, and the upper part of his fingers was curved like a sword. It was the Manjushri Vajra sword seal that symbolized cutting off all karma. At the same time, he saw Imagawa Kagumo chanting the mantra Luo, Bo, Lef, that. It was the secret mantra that he was familiar with and had never been taught to outsiders. With a loud bang, a fierce Mahamudra tore through the heavenly thunder and slapped toward Li Yundong's face in the blink of an eye. Li Yundong was shocked. How did this guy know the mantra Mahamudra Kung Fu? And he was so skilled. Li Yundong didn't have time to think. Without saying anything, he immediately put his palms together. His 2 middle fingers were upright. His 2 ring fingers were in the shape of a treasure. His 2 little fingers and thumb were scattered. His left index finger was vertical, and his right index finger was on the tip of his left index finger. He formed the lion speed seal of the immovable Wisdom King, which symbolized bravery and invincibility. Li Yundong flipped his palm and used the lion speed seal of the immovable Wisdom King to hit the other party's Manjushri Vajra sword seal without showing any weakness. For a moment, everyone's eyes widened and they didn't dare to breathe. They watched as the 2 golden Mahamudra quickly approached. They were all extremely nervous, waiting for the result of the collision. Would the thunder punishment suppress the Jinshin, or would the Jinshin break the thunder punishment? Chapter 709. On Mount Longhu, dark clouds covered the sky, and lightning flashed like a group of snakes dancing wildly. You almost there. All the tourists on the main peak of Mount Longhu could not be bothered to enjoy the scenery, nor could they be bothered to burn incense and pray to the gods. They were all staring at the strange and terrifying scene on a distant peak with their mouths agape. Many of them took out their phones and cameras to record the scene. While they were pointing and whispering to each other, there was suddenly a loud bang in the sky, as if there was a violent earthquake. Many people fell to the ground, and the dark clouds that had originally covered the top of the mountain were instantly dispersed. The tourists on the main peak immediately saw a shocking guardian deity standing in the sky, surrounded by blue flames. Not far away, there was a Baoxiang bodhisattva sitting cross-legged on a lotus throne. These 2 gods had only appeared for a moment. Many tourists holding mobile phones and cameras had been too focused on taking pictures, so when their feet suddenly trembled, their hands trembled and they did not manage to take pictures of the scene in front of them. But when they came back to their senses and wanted to take pictures again, the dark clouds in the sky quickly gathered together and became thicker than before. They wanted to see the guardian deity and the bodhisattva again, but they could no longer. Seeing such an abnormal situation, the tourists on Mount Longhu kept exclaiming and pointing at the distant peak. They looked from afar and thought that it was caused by the cumulus clouds in the thunderstorm, but they did not know that it was a fierce battle between the two top cultivators of China and Japan. Although this battle wasn't as intense as the battle with Shota Takahashi, it was still more dangerous than the one he had fought with. Li Yundong and Imagawa Kagumo patted each other from afar. With a loud bang, Li Yundong's Jinshin Yang spirit was shattered in an instant. The moment his Yang spirit was shattered, a bolt of heavenly thunder suddenly fell from the sky and struck straight at the top of his head. Although Li Yunyang was shocked, his reaction was extremely fast. He immediately controlled the countless Yang spirit clones that had been scattered to gather above his head. The moment he gathered them, the heavenly thunder instantly struck. With a loud crack, Li Yundong looked as if he had been struck by lightning. The cultivators of all sects in China were so shocked that they exclaimed in unison. At the same time, the Japanese cultivation world also burst into cheers. However, after this thunderbolt, Li Yundong's body did not tilt as everyone had imagined, and he was struck by the heavenly thunder until he spat out a mouthful of blood. Instead, his whole body emitted countless golden brilliance in an instant, and he looked like he was about to explode. You almost there, those who reacted quickly immediately understood that Li Yundong had used his Jinshin to protect his body and take the blow head-on, so that his body would not be destroyed by the heavenly thunder. Although he had the protection of the Jinshin, his physical injuries were still serious. A strange and unusual red color suddenly flashed across Li Yundong's face. It was obvious that all the qi and blood in his body had been shaken at that moment, and he couldn't even recite the scriptures in his mouth. Li Yundong was like this, and Imagawa Xingyun was not much better. Previously, he had formed the demon-slaying formation with his disciple to reseal the mystical silver fox. Although he had failed after that, driving this powerful true method had still caused him a violent backlash. At this time, his injuries had not yet healed, and he was fighting with Li Yundong so intensely. His chest was also agitated, and all the qi and blood in his body seemed to be rebelling, running around in the meridians in his body. Unlike Li Yundong, Imagawa Xingyun's face had turned pale. Li Yundong's qi and blood were sufficient, so when the qi and blood in his body were surging violently, his face was as red as Guangong. Imagawa Xingyun's injuries had not yet healed, and he had vigorously mobilized his qi and blood to generate zhenqi and dharma power. He was already old, and he had been injured before. At this time, his face was as pale as paper. After the two of them fought head-on, they took a deep breath at the same time and immediately reinvigorated themselves. Once again, the two of them made a Mahamudra and slapped each other. This time, Imagawa Xingyun made the outer 5 cobalt seal, one of the 5 great void bodhisattva hand seals, while Li Yundong made the 3 cobalt vajrapani seal, one of the 14 fundamental seals of the immovable wisdom king. These two Mahamudra were both fierce kung fu. As soon as they came into contact, there was a loud bang, as if 2 missiles had collided, causing a violent explosion. The heavenly thunder that fell from the sky was shaken and scattered in all directions. For a moment, many cultivators on the scene were scared out of their wits by the flying heavenly thunder. They all took out their magic treasures to prevent themselves from being accidentally injured. Although the battle between Li Yundong and Imagawa Xingyun did not see any blood, it was as dangerous as fighting with bayonets in a rain of bullets. The slightest carelessness could lead to the destruction of both body and soul. Everyone saw the two of them performing their Mahamudra Kung Fu. On the other hand, Imagawa Xingyun made the 8 characters Manjushri Great Essence Seal, Maitreya Bodhisattva Lotus Palm Seal, Void Bodhisattva Samaya Seal, Vajrapani Karma Seal, Sunlight Bodhisattva Mahamudra Karma Seal, Vajrapani Dharma Bodhisattva Mahamudra Karma Seal. On the other hand, Li Yundong quickly made the single Cobalt Seal, Treasure Mountain Seal, Flaming Wheel Seal, Suwa Seal, and 3 Cobalt Vajrapani Seal. The two Mahamudra blasted each other, and the rumbling sound in the air was endless, mixed with the bursts of thunder. The air was almost shattered. Many cultivators with lower cultivation could not help but cover their ears, afraid of the sound. You almost there, the tourists on the main peak in the distance looked over and felt that the roar between heaven and earth was like the roar of the gods, like the roar of the earth. It really made people feel the fear of the end of the world. Although Imagawa Xingyun's cultivation was higher than Li Yundong's, he was injured after all, and he was old. Although his cultivation Xueqi was hidden deep in the three dantians, at this time, he had to defend against the heavenly thunder in the sky and fight against Li Yundong's yang spirit. The Xueqi that he usually stored had long been used up. At this time, he had to force his qi and blood to transform into Xueqi to fight against Li Yundong. As the saying goes, the fist is afraid of the strong. It was the same for cultivation. Li Yundong was only about 20 years old at this time. He had a body reborn from the Jindan, and he was also a child's Yuanyang body. When he was in the Zhuji phase, he had also gone through a lot of hard training. His qi and blood were abundant, and there was no one else in the world who could compare. Although Li Yundong's cultivation was not as good as Imagawa Xingyun's, his physical body was much stronger than Imagawa Xingyun's. On one side was an old man who was about to die, and on the other side was a young man who was in the prime of his life. Under the tug of war between the two, the situation slowly began to turn. Although Li Yundong had been at a disadvantage before, at this time, with his young and strong capital, he began to slowly suppress Imagawa Xingyun. In the beginning, the Mahamudra that Li Yundong used was simple and short Mahamudra Kung Fu in order to be fast. But now the more he fought, the more valiant he became. The Mahamudra in his mouth became longer and longer, and the power of the Mahamudra in his hands became stronger and stronger. The originally calm dragon tree Bodhisattva was also shaken to the point that her body was slanted, and there was a faint sign that she was about to be shattered. The cultivators of the Japanese cultivation world changed their expressions, and their eyes were filled with worry. At this time, a few monks of the Tian Tai sect sat cross-legged on the ground and began to loudly chant scriptures. It was the Dharma Sutra, which was known as the King of Scriptures. I saw that you were extremely tired and wanted to retreat, so I used the power of convenience to create this city. You are diligent, and you should share the most precious treasures. I will also do the same, for all teachers. As soon as they began chanting, the dragon tree Bodhisattva, who had been on the verge of collapse in mid-air, suddenly shone with a golden light. In an instant, she sat firmly on the lotus throne, and with great momentum, she launched a fierce counterattack toward Li Yundong. The cultivators of the various Chinese sects on the sidelines were not fools. At this time, seeing this situation, how could they not know what had happened? They all cursed, "Shameless! How dare you help outside? Despicable! Isn't it a one-on-one fight? Why did you use the magic formation to help? Are you bullying us because we don't have any help?" Although Zhang Ling of the Zhengyi school had a grudge against Li Yundong, at this time, they were facing a great enemy and had a common enemy. Naturally, she could not watch Li Yundong be defeated. Zhang Ling shouted, "Despicable villain, using such means. Even if you win, do you feel proud?" Zhengyi disciples, form the formation. There were many disciples of the Zhengyi school. When they shouted in unison, their voices immediately drowned out the chanting of the monks. Each of them held a sword in their hand and stared at the cultivators of the various sects in Japan. The cultivators of the various sects in Japan were not to be outdone. They glared at each other, and the shadows of their swords and knives clashed. At this time, Li Yundong knew that if he did not fight with all his might at this time, he would definitely lose this battle. He suddenly shouted loudly, and the one-headed and two-armed Akalanatha instantly transformed into the Dharmakaya of Akalanatha with 3 heads and 6 arms. The 3 vertical pupils on his forehead opened angrily, and his 6 hands kept pinching the Taoist seals, shooting toward Imagawa Kagumo like a series of cannons. At this time, all of Li Yundong's Xueqi, qi, and blood had surged to the peak state. Both his physical body and yang spirit had reached the highest realm he could reach at present. In the past, when he fought with others, he had almost always relied on his fierce attacks to quickly defeat the enemy. He had never fought such a high-intensity battle of attrition like now. In such a high-intensity battle, if it had been anyone else, they would have long been exhausted. However, Li Yundong's Xueqi and Dharma power seemed to be inexhaustible. The more he fought, the stronger and more vigorous it became. The more he fought, the more excited his own body became. The qi and blood in his 5 internal organs were rolling like crazy motors, madly producing blood and circulating blood. The fresh blood was quickly transported to his whole body and turned into strength. Soon, it gathered with the essence qi in his lower dantian to form blood qi, strength, and essence qi. Finally, the 3 qis condensed in the upper dantian. At this time, Li Yundong had really lost his temper. He had fallen into a state of madness. Without waiting for the people of Zhengyi school to help, he began to fight back crazily. In Imagawa Kagumo's opinion, at this time, his opponent should temporarily avoid his sharpness and adopt a defensive stance. After slowly exhausting his external help, he would slowly counterattack, especially since Li Yundong was a Jinshin master. His realm was lower than his, so there was absolutely no reason for him to take the initiative to counterattack. However, Li Yundong was like a newborn calf that was not afraid of tigers. He was full of spirit and courage. He repeatedly counterattacked in places that no one could think of and dared to think of, achieving a shocking reversal. A battle between masters only lasted for a moment. Imagawa Kagumo did not expect it, and his Jinshin was suffocated by Li Yundong. The faces of the few monks who had formed the formation to help Imagawa Kagumo became redder and redder in front of Li Yundong's sudden and violent attack. Their faces were so red that it seemed as if blood was about to drip out. Although the cultivation of the few monks was not low, they could not compare to Li Yundong, who had vigorous Xueqi. Moreover, although the power of the formation was great and could support Imagawa Kagumo from afar, the biggest weakness of the formation was its shortcoming. The power of a formation did not depend on the most powerful person in the formation, but on the weakest person in the formation. Once the weakest person could not hold on first, it would immediately cause a flaw in the perfect formation, causing the entire formation to collapse. After a few rounds, Li Yundong made 3 big hand seals, including the Flaming Devil Heavenly Hand Seal, the Vairocana Dharma Boundary Seal, and the Heavenly Drum Thunder Sound Buddha. They could topple mountains and overturn seas, and they slammed down like a storm. Immediately, a master with yang spirit cultivation screamed. In an instant, all the meridians in his body exploded with a bang, and his entire body exploded into a bloody man. His scream immediately caused the formation to shatter. The dragon tree Bodhisattva, who was sitting on the lotus throne, also swayed. The lotus throne was shattered by Li Yundong's great Vajra wheel seal, and he fell to the clouds. Imagawa Kagumo's body also spat out a mouthful of blood. His body tilted and he fell to the ground. Just as he fell, the heavenly thunder in the sky suddenly stopped bombarding. The thick dark clouds slowly drifted away, and the sky became clear and bright again. The roar of the heavenly thunder was hidden in the clouds, and the deafening sound of the big hand seals also dissipated in the vast sky. The side peak of Dragon Tiger Mountain was extremely quiet. Everyone looked at a young man who was panting violently in the field, dumbfounded. They all knew that this earth-shattering battle would definitely be recorded in the history of the cultivation world of China. In this battle, Li Yundong used the power of Jinshin to break the power of the opponent's thunder punishment, and truly established his reputation as Invincible Li. Today, I am heading north to the capital. The time is too tight, and there is only one night watch left. I will return from Beijing on the 3rd, and I will make up for it in the future, please forgive me. Chapter 7:10. When the Japanese Tiantai sect monks saw Imagawa Kagumo falling to the ground, some of them who could still move immediately rushed to him and held him up, crying out loud. Imagawa Kagumo spat out a mouthful of blood. His face was as pale as a sheet as he fell to the ground. After he was supported by the middle-aged monk, he faintly felt as if someone was shouting something at him. He struggled to open his eyes and forced a smile at the middle-aged monk in front of him. He reached out his hand and caressed the monk's head. Then, he recited a passage from the Dharma Sutra. The Holy Lord, the King of Dharma, comforts the infinite. When I die, you shall not be afraid. After reciting, Imagawa Kagumo panted and said, After I die, I can appoint Takacho Yukino as the sect leader. Please support me. Unfortunately, none of you can truly inherit my legacy. It's a pity that I'm leaving. Also, Hideyoshi, remember to restrain your disciples when you go back. Don't let them take revenge for me. As long as this person doesn't become an immortal in China and doesn't die, none of you are allowed to step on this land. Remember, remember, remember. The middle-aged monk named Hideyoshi was shocked and said angrily, Sect leader, you'll be fine. What do you mean by that? Why can't we take revenge? Why? Imagawa Kagumo smiled and said in a low and slow voice, Now that I've seen the world, I've become a Buddha in peace. I'm happy that I've gained something good. The masses are always troubled, the blind have no teacher. They don't know the path of suffering, they don't know how to seek relief. The long night increases evil, and reduces the number of people in the heavens. From the underworld to the underworld, I'll never hear the name of Buddha. He recited the Dharma Sutra in a low voice, and his voice gradually became softer. When he reached the last word, the smile on his face froze, and he stopped breathing. He passed away on the spot. Hideyoshi could faintly feel that the scripture recited by his master before he passed on seemed to have a deep meaning, but at that moment, his heart was filled with grief and he did not have time to think about it. He knelt down in front of a Magawa Kagumo, prostrated himself on the ground, and started crying loudly. The rest of the monks from the Tiantai sect who had not fainted also burst into tears. For a moment, the sound of crying could be heard in the Longhu Taoist field. Li Yundong had used the power of Jinshin to break the thunder retribution. The cultivators of all sects in China were both shocked and delighted. Although there were cultivators of the Tiantai sect who were crying and crying, they were all smiling and whispering to each other about the earth-shattering battle just now, exchanging their own experiences with each other. Ziyangzi looked at Li Yunyang in awe and said in a low voice, "Jinshin breaking through the thunder tribulation happened more than 200 years ago. I didn't expect that I would be able to witness it with my own eyes today. Li Wudi lives up to his reputation." Mao Yuchong looked at the man who was younger than her with a complicated gaze. She opened her mouth to say something, but in the end, she didn't say anything. Li Yundong was panting heavily in the field. This battle was the most dangerous and intense one he had ever had since he started cultivating. His zhenqi was strong and his spiritual power was powerful. He was unparalleled in the world. Even when he had been fighting with people on Mount Tianlong, he had never felt tired. But at this time, his whole body was trembling slightly. He could even clearly feel that his 2 waste kidneys had been drained to the point of pain. It was obvious that the previous fight had consumed a lot of his essence, qi, and blood. He was already a little overdrawn. Li Yundong took a deep breath and used his breathing to slowly adjust the chaotic qi and blood in his body. His originally flushed and abnormal face gradually calmed down. At this time, Li Yundong recalled the battle just now and couldn't help but have a trace of doubt in his heart. Logically speaking, the other party was also in the Thunder Retribution realm. Even if he couldn't hold on, there was no reason for him to lose so quickly. Especially with the support of the magic formation, he was immediately defeated after a series of fierce attacks. Li Yundong had an old injury, and he had taken advantage of it? Li Yundong was about to ask when he saw Hideyoshi pick up the golden body of a Magawa Kagumo and glare at Li Yundong fiercely. He wiped away his tears and strode to the side of the field. Li Yundong glanced at him and wanted to say something but stopped on second thought. He had no intention of stopping him. Although the 2 sides were enemies, Li Yundong still admired Imagawa Kagumo's cultivation. Although he didn't know who Imagawa Kagumo had learned the Mahamudra Kung Fu from, the other party's mastery of the Mahamudra Kung Fu was deep and his skill was pure. It was above and not below him. Zi Yuan, who was at the side of the field, saw this scene. She sighed softly and said, "Alas, Li Yundong has made another enemy. Zhenyan Tantrism, Pure Land True Sect, and Tiantai Sect are the 3 strongest sects of Japanese Buddhism. He has offended all of them. How can this be?" Zhou Qin had a strong personality. She raised her eyebrows and said, "We'll deal with it when it comes. Are we afraid of these little Japanese? If they want to fight, then we'll fight." Zi Yuan shook her head and said, "It's not good, it's not good. As the saying goes, it's better to get rid of enmity than to keep it alive." These 3 sects almost represent the power of the Japanese Buddhist cultivation world. No matter how powerful Li Yundong is, it's impossible for him to withstand their continuous challenges in the future. If this goes on, there will be endless troubles. If Li Yundong still wants to cultivate quietly, it will be wishful thinking. Zhou Qin was a little unconvinced and argued, "Is it better to lose? There's no point in giving in to these Japanese. Only by beating them into submission, defeating them, and beating them into submission will they truly be at peace." As she said this, she turned to Suchan and said, "Suchan, tell me, who's right between us?" Suchan looked at Zi Yuan and then at Zhou Qin. Suddenly she smiled and said, "Both of you are right and wrong." Zhou Qin and Zi Yuan both looked at her curiously and asked, "What do you mean?" Suchan smiled and said, "In my opinion, as the saying goes, if one's heart is in one place, there will be 84,000 tribulations. In the world of the 3 realms, there is only one true method. It's useless to say this now. It's important to see what Yundong thinks, says and does." Zhou Qin and Zi Yuan both laughed. Zhou Qin pointed at Suchan and said with a smile, Ha, isn't this the sutra? After watching a battle, you can actually learn and apply it on the spot. Amazing. No wonder Master likes you so much. You're so sweet and good at talking. Zi Yuan also smiled and looked at Li Yundong. Although her expression was no longer solemn, there was still a hint of worry in her eyes. Su Chan giggled and said, "Not at all. I still have to learn more from Sister Zi Yuan and Sister Zhou Qin. By the way, why didn't Imagawa Kagumo's young spirit come out after he died?" Seeing that Li Yundong had won consecutive victories, Zhou Qin also relaxed a lot. She said to Su Chan with a smile, "I don't know either. You have to ask our great Zhenren Zi Yuan." Zi Yuan smiled faintly and said, "Buddhist cultivators don't pay attention to ascension. Apart from fighting, they almost never leave their young spirits unless their physical bodies are destroyed. Otherwise, even if they die in meditation, the young spirits will remain in their physical bodies until they are cremated. Only then will their young spirits be thrown back into the samsara realm to be reincarnated. Because of this, many eminent monks' golden bodies are cremated after they die, and there are often many relics left behind. This is the product of the cremation of the young spirit when it wraps around the body." Only then did the two of them understand. When they looked at the field again, Hideyoshi walked to the side of the field with the golden body of Imagawa Kagumo in his arms. After a few loud words with Saionji Tsunekatsu, he and the other monks of the Tiantai sect walked to the side of the field with the injured disciples and recited scriptures for Saionji Tsunekatsu. Saionji Tsunekatsu looked at them worriedly. 2 of the 3 pillars of Japanese Buddhism had been lost, and only the Zhenyan Tantrism had not yet made a move. They were the only ones left, and it was difficult for them to do anything alone. At this time, when the cultivators of various sects in Japan saw that Imagawa Kagumo, a master of thunder retribution, had died in front of them, their hearts were so heavy that they couldn't speak. After a long time, a cultivator from the Dashang sect of Japanese Shintoism said angrily, "Are we going to stop here? Everyone, it doesn't matter if we are defeated, but our Japanese cultivation world has been defeated by the same person one after another. Can we bear such humiliation? Is there no one else who will rise up again?" They were really shocked by Li Yundong's fighting methods. In the first round, Li Yundong had shown that he was not afraid of any Buddhist magic power and that his Xueqi was strong and fierce. In the second round, Li Yundong had shown his exquisite fighting methods and outstanding wit. In the third round, Li Yundong had simply defeated the strong with the weak. His Jinshin had broken the thunder retribution. This battle not only showed Li Yundong's wisdom and courage, but also let everyone see the majestic and vigorous Xueqi of Li Yundong. In their opinion, without a cultivation as vast as the sea, it was absolutely impossible to persist in such a fighting environment, let alone defeat a master of thunder retribution. Fighting with such an opponent, it was really frightening. Seeing that there was no response from the crowd, the cultivator's face was full of grief and indignation. He then shouted loudly, "Are we going to let Li Yundong use our failure as the cornerstone to build his invincible reputation? Don't you feel ashamed? I don't believe that Li Yundong is really invincible, Li." At this time Ise Chuyun, who was like an iceberg, said, "I saw that Li Yundong was still overdrawn in the battle just now. At this time, if there is another master, he will definitely not be able to hold on. Even if he wins again by luck, it will definitely be a Pyrrhic victory. If he fights in a wheel formation, he will definitely be defeated." When the cultivators of the various sects in Japan heard this, their eyes lit up. They all knew that although Ise Chuyun's character was as cold as ice and she didn't like to talk much, as long as she spoke, she would definitely be right. The cultivator who had spoken before suddenly became spirited and said loudly, "Miss Chuyun is right. Let me pave the way for you in the next round." Immediately, someone advised, "Otsuka, your cultivation is no match for Li Yundong. It's dangerous for you to go on stage." Otsuka said angrily, "Compared with the face of our Japanese cultivation world, my life is nothing." After that he was about to go on stage, but as soon as he moved, he saw an arm in front of him. It was Saionji Tsunekatsu who had stopped him. Otsuka was stunned. Just as he was about to scold him angrily, he heard Saionji Tsunekatsu say, "Otsuka, I have a feud with Li Yundong. Leave this to me." Otsuka stared at him for a long time, then bowed and said, "I wish you victory." Saionji Tsunekatsu put his palms together and returned the salute. Thank you. Although Ise Shinguang appreciated Li Yundong, at this time, It was a matter of the overall situation. He didn't dare to be careless, so he warned Saionji Tsunekatsu. Chongqing, Li Yundong is almost an arrow at the end of its flight. When you go on stage, you must attack fiercely. Remember, don't give him a chance to breathe. Isi Chuyun also warned. Chongqing Jun, Li Yunyang is the reincarnation of Wisdom King. Only people with a high cultivation level can beat him with the power of Buddhism. Your cultivation is about the same as his. Don't compete with him in terms of Dharma power. Focus on close combat. Saionji Tsunekatsu respectfully clasped his hands together to return the salute. After thanking them, he walked to Kaisai Hikaryuni's side and knelt down. Kaisai Hikaryuni stretched out his hand and stroked his head. After that, Saionji Tsunekatsu jumped up and strode into the field without looking back. He shouted at Li Yundong. Li Yundong, do you still remember me? Do you dare to fight with me again? Before Li Yundong had time to speak, the cultivators of the various sects next to him all shouted, "Shameless, taking turns to fight. Do you dare to be more shameless? Why don't you swarm up together?" Little Japan is little Japan. Their means are despicable and endless. Zhenren Li, don't be provoked by him. At this time, Zi Yuan also said to Li Yundong in a loud voice, "Zhenren Li, let me fight in this game." However, Li Yundong's eyes were fixed on Saionji Tsunekatsu. With his intelligence and reaction, how could he not know what the other party was planning? He thought to himself, this time, I have offended so many Japanese cultivation sections. In the future, they will find trouble with me. Although I am not afraid, the people around me will inevitably be implicated. If I want these Japanese to not dare to retaliate in the future, I must beat them until they are convinced. In the future, when they mention my name, they will tremble all over and their legs will tremble. Thinking of this, Li Yundong snorted coldly and said in a loud voice, "Saionji Tsunekatsu, a defeated opponent, dares to be so arrogant? Come here, let me see what progress you have made." Someone asked me if I would update on the 3rd. Of course not. These days, I will try my best to ensure that the updates are normal, but I will make up for the missing updates when I come back. There will be updates in the evening. Chapter 7:11. Ever since Saionji Tsunekatsu had been defeated by Li Yundong with one palm, he had learned from the pain. His originally flamboyant and violent temperament had also become much calmer. Although he had been enlightened by the Mandala 5 tribes of Kaisai Hikari, and his cultivation had improved greatly, he did not dare to be careless when facing Li Yundong again. 9078. 8C3A4I6H507N8G67E9N8X0U2E30. 9C709M8 Saionji Tsunekatsu deliberately provoked Li Yundong with arrogant words, but he didn't expect that Li Yundong would really accept the challenge. He had prepared a lot of words, but at this time, he didn't need them. Under the ecstasy in his heart, he became calmer and calmer. Many cultivators on the sidelines shouted at Li Yundong, "Zhenren Li, don't be provoked by this little Japanese. You have won 3 games in a row. Even Vajra Arhat can't stand it. Come down and take a rest before fighting." There were also cultivators who shouted at Saionji Tsunekatsu, King Japanese, you only know how to take advantage of this kind of advantage. What kind of ability is that? If you have the ability, let Zhenren Li rest for 3 days. 3 days is not enough, at least 3 years. Haha, 3 years? In 3 years, Zhenren Li has already cultivated to the golden immortal realm and ascended. I'm afraid that this little Japanese will never be able to take revenge for the rest of his life. Saionji Tsunekatsu turned a deaf ear to these curses. He looked at Li Yundong and said in a deep voice, "Zhenren Li, you attacked me in the previous battle. In this battle I must get justice." His words were righteous. Some people who didn't know the truth thought that Li Yundong had used disgraceful means to deal with him. For a moment, some cultivators on the sidelines looked at each other and cursed in a much lower voice. Li Yundong looked up and laughed. What a joke. It's really a thief crying to catch a thief. Saionji Tsunekatsu, I haven't seen you for a few days. I don't know if your kung fu has improved, but your eloquence has improved a lot. Do you want to compete with me in eloquence? Well, I'll accompany you. The two of them engaged in a battle of words and attacked each other. It seemed to be a harmless exchange of words, but every single word struck directly at the other's Tao heart. Once their wills wavered, their cultivations would be greatly reduced. But at this time, Li Yundong raised his voice and said, "Sayonjitsu Nakatsu, if you are afraid, I will stand still and let you hit me 3 times first. How about that?" Li Yundong's words caused another uproar outside the arena. Everyone looked at Li Yundong with their mouths agape. They were not fools. Naturally, they could see Li Yundong's current situation. Not to mention letting Sayonjitsu Nakatsu hit him 3 times, he wouldn't be able to withstand it. 3 times? Even a Vajra made of iron or a Luohan made of copper would be smashed into pieces. However, Li Yundong had won 3 games in a row, and his momentum was so strong that no one dared to underestimate him. They all looked at Li Yundong in surprise and doubt, speculating about the truth of his words. Was he bluffing and deliberately mystifying, or was he trying to lure the enemy and repeat the same trick? Li Yundong had asked Takahashi Shota to cut himself 3 times, but Takahashi Shota had been shocked to death. Now Li Yundong had asked Sayonjitsu Nakatsu to hit himself 3 times. What would the result be? Would he be shocked to death as well? Did Li Yundong still have strength left? Everyone was talking and guessing. Sayonjitsu Nakatsu also looked at Li Yundong with a vigilant face. His eyes stared at Li Yundong like a hawk and a wolf, as if to see through his false reality. However, there was always a faint smile on Li Yundong's face, and his eyes were bright. He was as steady as a mountain and as deep as water. The wind didn't move him, and the waves didn't stir him. There was no clue at all. Could it be that this Li Yundong really has strength left? Or is this just a psychological war? What if he really has strength left? Such a thought involuntarily emerged in Sayonjitsu Nakatsu's heart. As soon as this thought came up, it took root like a devil, lingering and unable to be dispelled. But after all, he was one of the best of the younger generation of Jinyan Tantrism. After being defeated by Li Yundong, although there was some shadow in his heart, his character became more and more firm. He took a deep breath, calmed down, and forced the distracting thoughts out of his mind. Seeing that he couldn't get any advantage from talking, he stopped arguing with Li Yundong. He said in a deep voice, "Zhenren Li, I won't take advantage of you if I can't kill you with words. Let's have a fair competition." Many cultivators in the Chinese cultivation world on the sidelines booed when they heard this. "How shameless you are!" Sayonjitsu Nakatsu was like a clay doll with no self and no living beings. He didn't seem to hear what was going on around him. However, Li Yundong smiled and said, "Well, bring it on." Sayonjitsu Nakatsu saw that Li Yundong was no longer forcing him to fight 3 times first. His heart suddenly moved and he thought, Li Yundong must be an arrow at the end of its flight. He is bluffing. His eyes suddenly lit up, and he was secretly happy. Just as he was about to step forward and attack, Li Yundong suddenly opened his eyes, like the angry eyes of Vajra. His eyes spewed out 2 sharp eyes like lightning, shooting at him like sharp arrows. Before, Li Yundong's momentum was really light, like a gentle breeze, but at this time, it suddenly turned into a storm, thunder and lightning. Especially this stare, the contrast was so great that it really had the terrible momentum of Guangong doesn't open his eyes, but when he opens his eyes, he wants to kill. Sayonjitsu Nakatsu was shocked and shouted in his heart, "He still has strength left." He was really luring the enemy just now. This devil, how could he still have strength left? The cultivators of the Japanese cultivation world were also tongue-tied, looking at Li Yundong as if they were looking at a devil. Ise Chuyun, who had previously asserted that Li Yundong was an arrow at the end of its flight, was also stunned. His cherry mouth opened into a shape, and he couldn't say anything for a long time. Everyone saw that Li Yundong didn't move much, but his body flew out like a cannonball. In the blink of an eye, he appeared in front of Sayonjitsu Nakatsu. His momentum was fierce and explosive, and he moved like a bow, like thunder. Li Yundong's figure instantly rushed in front of Sayonjitsu Nakatsu. His body was like a bow, his 5 fingers opened, and like a devil's claw, he hit Sayonjitsu Nakatsu's face with both hands. When Li Yundong had not yet reached the Juji phase, he had often fought hand-to-hand with others, especially when he had just started cultivating. At this time, he was fighting hand-to-hand with his opponent with the cultivation of the Jinshin phase. The strength of his power was really shocking. His 5 fingers were as strong as iron claws, and the strength of each finger penetrated through the fingertip. With one claw, even the steel plate would be scratched 5 holes, let alone the flesh. Saionji Tsunekatsu didn't expect Li Yundong to have such power. He was shocked and quickly retreated to avoid the edge. But as soon as he retreated, Li Yundong's feet were fast, step by step. He immediately turned his wrist, and the back of his hand was like a steel whip, slamming towards Saionji Tsunekatsu's throat. Saionji Tsunekatsu was also a fighting master, proficient in all kinds of ancient Japanese martial arts. He saw that Li Yundong was already close to him and began to fight hand to hand. His momentum was fierce, and it really should be the saying in the Fist Sutra, the good fighter has a short momentum, and his momentum is fast. Saionji Tsunekatsu also knew that he could not keep retreating like this. Otherwise, once the other party's momentum soared, he would definitely lose. He gritted his teeth, immediately raised his hand, and hit Li Yundong's raised armpit with a knife in his hand. But at this time, Li Yundong seemed to have expected him to do this. He immediately raised his other hand and put it on his arm. As soon as their arms touched, both of them trembled at the same time. Li Yundong's wrist suddenly turned, and his 5 fingers were like hooks. He grabbed Saionji Tsunekatsu's wrist and pulled his arm down in front of him, not letting him move again. Saionji Tsunekatsu immediately raised his other hand and hit Li Yundong's face with a whip elbow. At this time, Li Yundong raised his hand again and touched his arm. In the same way, his 5 fingers grabbed the opponent's elbow and pulled the opponent's hand down again. He pulled the opponent's hands down and put them on his chest. At this time, both of them were holding hands. It seemed to be a tie, but many people in the Japanese cultivation world exclaimed, "Not good. Chongqing, be careful." Although Li Yundong was holding the opponent's hand with both hands, because Saionji Tsunekatsu's hands were crossed in front of him, one hand was pressed under the other hand. At this time, Li Yundong instantly released his hand that was pressed under the pressure, raised his hand, and hit Saionji Tsunekatsu's head with his elbow. These 3 consecutive attacks were as fast as thunder and interlocked. The Japanese with discerning eyes immediately exclaimed, "Yama's 3 points. Baji fist." Deng Yu and Deng Jiao, who were on the sidelines, looked at the field nervously and blankly. They heard many Japanese people shouting, "Baji Baji." They couldn't help but be curious. Deng Yu asked, "Shiji Lu Feng, what are these Japanese shouting? What is Baji?" Zhang Lufeng stared at the field intently, for fear of missing a movement. She explained without turning her head, "It's the 8 extremities fist of Tai Chi brings peace to the world in literature. 8 extremities fist of martial arts." Deng Yu asked curiously, "Is Baji fist very powerful? Do these Japanese also know about it?" Zhang Lufeng said quickly, "Whether it's the Japanese cultivation world or the Japanese martial arts world, they all recognize Baji fist as the most powerful fist technique in the martial arts world of China. In the Republic of China, Li Shuwen, the Baji grandmaster, had 3 disciples. The eldest disciple, Huadianga, served as the martial arts instructor and guard officer of the last emperor, Puyi. He didn't leave until the puppet Manchu Kuo. His last disciple, Lu Yunqiao, served as the instructor and guard officer of Chiang Kai-shek's bodyguards. So, you know the power of Baji fist, don't you?" Deng Yu and Deng Jiao exclaimed in unison and looked at Li Yundong with widened eyes. Li Yundong's whip elbow blasted towards Saionji Tsunekatsu. Saionji Tsunekatsu's hands were pressed down by one of Li Yundong's hands. It was too late for him to dodge or defend. He could only condense all his zhenqi on his forehead. He lowered his head and hit Li Yundong's elbow with an iron head skill. With a bang sound, the 2 bodies collided, but the sound of metal and stone was heard. Their bodies suddenly shook, and they were shaken by their respective forces and took a step back. Although the forehead was the hardest bone of the human body, and Saionji Tsunekatsu had also practiced hard outer kung fu, the head was the most vulnerable part of the human body. When he collided with Li Yundong, there was a sudden dizziness in his brain, as if there was water flowing and shaking, and his ears were buzzing. He was about to retreat in shock, but he suddenly saw a strange and enchanting blush flash across Li Yundong's face. But Li Yundong quickly took a deep breath, and his face quickly returned to normal. Saionji Tsunekatsu was stunned, but soon his heart moved. He found that Li Yundong was indeed an arrow at the end of its flight. At this time, he must have forced his strength to launch such a fierce blow. In ecstasy, Saionji Tsunekatsu immediately dispelled the idea of retreating, and stepped toward Li Yundong. He bowed his knees, his 5 fingers slightly bent, like a palm, like a fist, but not a palm. It was the killing skill of Kyokushin karate, Overlord Fist. But as soon as he punched out, Li Yundong immediately put his hand on his. After blocking his punch, he immediately stepped forward, raised his right hand high, and hit his opponent's chest with his elbow. Then the back of his hand, like a steel whip, hit Saionji Tsunekatsu's face. Saionji Tsunekatsu was shocked. He saw that Li Yundong's punch was even fiercer than the previous Yama's 3 points. He was shocked and angry. He couldn't help roaring with grief and indignation. This bastard lied to me again. He didn't dare to take the move and retreated again. Li Yundong was unforgiving. He made 2 moves, one after another. Although his whip hand was dodged by his opponent, after the whip hand hit nothing, he immediately turned his wrist, and his 5 fingers were like tiger claws, clawing toward his opponent's face. It was the ultimate killing skill of the 8th Supreme Grandmaster, Divine Spear Li Shuwen, who was invincible in the world. Tiger climbing the mountain. Well. Thank you for pointing it out. Some of the mistakes in the book have been corrected. I'm sorry. Thank you very much. Chapter 7:12. The unique skill of Bajiquan, Fierce Tiger Climbing the Mountain, was not only powerful and fierce, but also had many changes, especially this move, which was overbearing and arrogant. No matter how the opponent dealt with it, it only cared about hard. When Li Yundong's claw came, there was a sudden exclamation from the sidelines. Zhou Qin and the others only saw that their blood was boiling and their eyes were shining. She had once fought hand-to-hand with a master of Bajiquan and relied on an extremely brutal and tough fighting method to win. Zhou Qin was young and vigorous, and she had become famous in the world with this battle. It was not that she didn't have the idea that Bajiquan is only so. But at this time, when she saw Li Yundong's Bajiquan, it was really as fierce as a tiger, as powerful as a dragon, and unstoppable. She thought to herself, if Master had been on the field at that time, I was afraid that this move would have knocked me down. There would have been no chance for me to fight desperately. Su Chan clenched her fists and stared at the field nervously. She whispered, hurry up. 1 hit and the opponent will collapse. Just 1 more hit. She saw that Li Yundong was like a maggot attached to a bone, staring at Saionji Tsunekatsu and constantly fighting close to him. But Saionji Tsunekatsu was always able to avoid the fatal blow at the most critical time. She couldn't help but be so anxious that she wished she could go up and catch Saionji Tsunekatsu, who was like a loach. Zi Yuan stared at the field, and her expression became more and more serious. After watching for a while, she suddenly whispered, oh no. Li Yundong can't hold on. Zhou Qin turned her face in surprise and said, isn't Master suppressing the opponent? Why can't he hold on? Zi Yuan clenched her fists and said nervously, an arrow at the end of its flight can't wear silk. This is also why Li Yundong can still suppress Saionji Tsunekatsu after 3 consecutive battles. If it were another person, they would have long been short of breath, deficient in qi and blood, and their bodies would have collapsed. While she was talking, Li Yundong's offensive on the field had indeed slowed down. Although Saionji Tsunekatsu had been chased by Li Yundong like a storm and his body had been hit in many places by Li Yundong, he had been a master of the Jinshin phase before he was defeated by Li Yundong for the first time. After that, he had been enlightened by Kaisai Hikaryuni and his power had greatly increased. How could he be defeated so easily? At this time, he saw that Li Yundong's offensive had slowed down again, but he had learned from his mistakes. He didn't attack rashly anymore, but tentatively launched a counterattack against Li Yundong. With this counterattack, Li Yundong seemed to be unable to hold on and immediately retreated. Saionji Tsunekatsu was overjoyed and once again tentatively pressed forward. Li Yundong retreated again. At this time, even the cultivators on the sidelines could see that Li Yundong was on the verge of exhaustion. Many people in the Chinese cultivation world looked at the field with sighs and said, alas, Zhenren Li can't do it. I'm afraid he's going to lose this game. Sigh, Li Wudi isn't invincible after all. How can anyone win so many battles in a row without losing? Yeah, look at his opponents. 3 golden bodies and 1 lightning tribulation. It's terrible. Zhenren Li shouldn't have been in the limelight. He should have let someone else do it. Someone else? Who else can do it? Who dares to say that they can win against Saionji Tsunekatsu? The cultivators on the sidelines whispered to each other, but the situation on the field suddenly changed again. After Saionji Tsunekatsu chased after Li Yundong and attacked him several times, he found that Li Yundong really didn't have any strength left to attack again. His breathing was also extremely fierce, especially his face was purple and red, and his forehead was densely covered with sweat. Saionji Tsunekatsu no longer had any doubts and immediately rushed forward to attack wildly. Everyone saw his 2 arms waving a few shadows, as if a few arms had grown out of thin air on his shoulders, pressing down on Li Yundong and attacking wildly. Su Chan was so shocked that her face changed dramatically. She was about to exclaim, but she saw that Li Yundong didn't retreat but went forward. He turned a blind eye to Saionji Tsunekatsu's fierce attack. With a spin of his feet, he once again got close to Saionji Tsunekatsu. His body leaned towards Saionji Tsunekatsu, his shoulders were fixed, and he backhanded. It was one of the 8 unique skills of Bajiquan. Overlord breaks the reins. At this time, everyone on the field thought that Li Yundong's defeat was certain, but Li Yundong was seeking life and death, seeking victory and defeat, and once again making waves in an impossible place. Saionji Tsunekatsu was shocked. Just as he wanted to retreat, Li Yundong slapped him in the chest with his backhand, causing him to roar wildly. There was a sweet taste in his throat, and he almost spat out a mouthful of blood. Saionji Tsunekatsu also punched Li Yundong in the shoulder. There was a cracking sound in Li Yundong's shoulder, and one of his arms hung down softly. Li Yundong didn't even snort. Instead, his eyes became sharper and fiercer. He couldn't rush forward, and his other hand was like a tiger's claw, digging towards Saionji Tsunekatsu's chest. Saionji Tsunekatsu was so shocked that he didn't dare to fight with Li Yundong again. He retreated like crazy, and Li Yundong had already stuck to him. His feet were like a shadow, and his remaining arm was like a storm, pounding towards Saionji Tsunekatsu's chest. Everyone only heard a puff-puff sound, as if a boxer with both hands was hitting a sandbag. The sound was so close and fast that no one could tell that it was the sound of an arm blasting out. Everyone was frightened and thought, Li Yundong's one arm is so fierce. If it were 2 arms, I'm afraid that Saionji Tsunekatsu would have been turned into meat paste, right? At this time, Saionji Tsunekatsu could no longer get rid of Li Yundong. He struggled to support himself and retreated. Just as he was about to retreat to the side of the field, he suddenly saw a figure standing on the edge of the field. His heart moved, and he immediately flew toward the figure. At this time, Li Yundong had almost used up his last breath. If this breath could not kill the opponent, then he would be killed by Saionji Tsunekatsu. He immediately chased after him like a shadow, turned his body, and turned his hand to slap towards Saionji Tsunekatsu. But as soon as he slapped out, he saw Saionji Tsunekatsu's body suddenly spin and push Lu Chunping, who had been standing on the side of the field, in front of him. After Lu Chunping was saved by Li Yundong, he had been standing on the side of the field like a wooden stake. At this time, his qi and blood were in disorder, and he needed to rest quietly. He could not move easily, so the cultivators on the side of the field did not care about him. Even in the previous battle with Imagawa Kagumo, the flying thunder and lightning had fortunately not hit his head. But at this time, Saionji Tsunekatsu saw that he could not stand it anymore, so he took him as a hostage and pushed him to Li Yundong's palm. At this time, the cultivators of the Chinese cultivation world on the side of the field were shocked with anger. Although they hated Lu Chunping very much, if Lu Chunping died here, there would be a terrible earthquake in the cultivation world. Saionji Tsunekatsu's killing with a borrowed knife was insidious, shameless, and despicable to the extreme. Su Chan, Zi Yuan, Zhou Qin, and the others cried out in horror at the same time. The cultivators of other sects also shouted angrily, shameless. Li Yundong didn't expect Saionji Tsunekatsu to be so despicable. Although he wanted to continue to slap the guy in front of him and Saionji Tsunekatsu into meat paste together. But Li Yundong's reason told him that he could not slap down. If he did, he would immediately cause a great disaster, and from then on, he would have to wander in Jianghu. It was not terrible for him to wander around, but did Su Chan want to live such a life with him? Didn't he promise her that he would make her happy? Even if she was willing, what about Zi Yuan? What about Zhou Qin? What about the other people of the Fox Zen school? Would they be implicated by him? At this moment, countless thoughts flashed through Li Yundong's mind. Li Yundong gritted his teeth and forcefully retracted the palm that was going to kill him. The force that he had sent out was retracted, which was no different from being hit by the other party. But at this time, Saionji Tsunekatsu was extremely hidden and sinister. From under the armpit of Lu Chunping, who was standing like a wooden stake, he fiercely stabbed Li Yundong in the chest. Saionji Tsunekatsu became a monk at the age of 6. At the age of 8, he was selected as a monk to guard the temple. At the age of 10, he began to travel around the world to cultivate hard. By the age of 20, he had become the youngest and most promising guardian of the temple in Zhenyan Tantrism. After so many years of cultivation, his whole body had been polished to be as hard as steel. If he hadn't met Li Yundong, a big pervert, he wouldn't have been beaten so badly. At this time, he suddenly counterattacked. He really had the courage to succeed or die. In addition, his palm went out from under Lu Chuanping's armpit. It was hidden and sinister, and even ghosts and gods couldn't defend against it. And Li Yundong was already an arrow at the end of its flight, and he abruptly took back the palm he had sent out. Under this situation, even if he was a god, he wouldn't be able to escape this. Everyone only heard a puff sound. Li Yundong's chest was stabbed by Saionji Tsunekatsu with a hand knife, as deep as his palm. Saionji Tsunekatsu was ecstatic. He was about to give Li Yundong another fatal blow, but just as he wanted to pull out his palm, he saw Li Yundong's eyes staring at him. His eyes were red like a wild beast, and one hand grabbed his wrist to prevent him from pulling it out. At this time, he flew up and kicked toward his temple. Saionji Tsunekatsu tilted his body and wanted to dodge, but he found that Li Yundong's foot was just a feint. He grabbed his hand and pulled it back. A huge force pulled his feet, and his body involuntarily rushed toward Li Yundong. Li Yundong opened his mouth and spat out a mouthful of blood, which pierced Saionji Tsunekatsu's chest from the side of Lu Chuanping's neck like a sharp arrow. Then he slapped Saionji Tsunekatsu's forehead with his palm. Saionji Tsunekatsu had never expected that Li Yundong would be able to fight back in such a situation, and the power was even more fierce than before. He felt a pain in his chest, and he roared angrily at Li Yundong's blood arrow. He subconsciously reached out to cover his chest. Seeing Li Yundong's palm coming at him, he wanted to dodge, but he found that the qi and blood in his body were in a mess. The blood arrow that Li Yundong had spat out had hit his Huagai acupoint. The qi in his body was in a mess, and he couldn't move. There was a flash of despair in Saionji Tsunekatsu's eyes. He watched helplessly as Li Yundong's palm came closer and closer and slapped toward his forehead. With a puff sound, Li Yundong's palm abruptly passed Lu Chunping and hit Saionji Tsunekatsu's forehead. Saionji Tsunekatsu's eyes widened, as if he couldn't believe that Li Yundong could kill him in such a situation. Saionji Tsunekatsu's whole body shook, and a stream of blood burst out of his body. All the blood in his body exploded, and he slowly fell to the ground. At this time, Li Yundong's chest also had a big hole, and blood was flowing out. His body shook a few times, and it seemed that he was about to fall to the ground, but after he staggered, he stabilized his body. At a glance, he saw that Saionji Tsunekatsu had been killed by his palm. He smiled and glanced at the side of the field. He saw that at this time, everyone on the field was looking at him with their mouths open. The little girl had already burst into tears and rushed toward him crazily. Behind her was a nervous Zi Yuan and an angry and anxious Zhou Qinj. Yundong, are you okay? Su Chan ignored the eyes around her and rushed to Li Yundong like crazy. She wanted to see the wound on Li Yundong's chest. She sobbed and said, "Don't scare me. You can't have anything happen to you." Li Yundong forced a smile and gently wiped the tears on Su Chan's cheek with his bloody fingers. He smiled gently and said, "Don't be silly, I'm fine." But before he could finish his words, his eyes suddenly went black, and he finally fell down on his back. All the cultivators on the side of the field exclaimed at the same time. They all stared at Li Yundong with their eyes wide open. This invincible Jinshin of Li Yundong, whose momentum was like a rainbow and whose figure was like a dragon, had finally broken. This man who seemed to never be knocked down had finally fallen. Chapter 7:13. Seeing this scene, Su Chan was so shocked that she almost fainted. Zi Yuan, who was beside her, immediately grabbed Li Yundong's arm and skillfully reconnected his dislocated arm with both hands. Then, she poured her zhenqi into Li Yundong's body without hesitation. 9078. 8C3A4I685007N8G67E9N8X0U2E30. 9C709M8. At this time, the cultivators of Zhengyi School, Chuanjin Dragon Sect, and other sects all gathered around. For a moment, The cultivators of all sects abandoned their sects and looked at Li Yundong, whose chest was bleeding with concern and anxiety. Zhang Kongyun quickly took out a jade bottle from his sleeve and handed it to Zi Yuan. He said in a deep voice, "Zi Yuan, hurry up and stop the bleeding." Zi Yuan reached out and took it without looking at it. She pulled out the stopper of the bottle and poured it toward Li Yundong's chest. The elixir, which was worth 1,000 gold per gram, was immediately diluted by the blood. At this time, Zi Yuan was worried and confused, as if she had lost her usual calmness. She hurriedly covered the wound on Li Yundong's chest with her hands, trying to suppress the blood from flowing out. However, Li Yundong's chest had been pierced by Saionji Tsunekatsu's palm. The wound was as big as a crocodile's mouth, so how could it be covered by her hands? Zi Yuan covered Li Yundong's chest with both hands, but blood kept gushing out of her chest. She used her fingers to point at Li Yundong's acupoints to help him stop the bleeding, but Li Yundong had been too exhausted before, and his qi and blood had already been boiling like a volcano. At this time, the injury on his chest was serious, and the chaotic qi and blood in his body had a place to go. They kept flowing out. How could acupuncture points stop the bleeding? Seeing that she couldn't stop the bleeding, Zi Yuan's face suddenly turned pale, her hands trembled slightly, and beads of sweat rolled down her forehead. At this time, Mao Yuchong of the Mao Shan sect also squeezed in front of her. She didn't care about comparing with Zi Yuan. She took out a purple gold jade bottle from her arms and said anxiously, "Try this. This is the jade-breaking rejuvenation ointment of our Mao Shan sect." Zi Yuan took it without saying a word and poured it into Li Yundong's wound without any hesitation. But as soon as she poured it, the blood still couldn't stop flowing. At this time, everyone was in a panic. Zi Yuan, who was usually calm, was as anxious as an ant on a hot pan. Zhou Qin's eyes were red, and she glared fiercely at the cultivators of various sects in Japan. She made up her mind that if anything happened to Li Yundong, she would rush over and fight with them. Anyway, if Li Yundong died, she wouldn't live either. At this time, the little girl suddenly quieted down. She looked at him with tears in her eyes and said in a low voice, "Yundong, you won't leave me alone, will you? If you leave, she will be all alone and pitiful. If someone bullies her in the future, who will take care of her? Do you have the heart to do that?" As she spoke, the little girl's tears fell. Her tears dripped on Li Yundong's palm, like warm spring water moistening the cracked earth, making Li Yundong, who was in a coma, vaguely feel that someone on the distant shore seemed to be calling him. Li Yundong only felt that he was trapped in a dark and chaotic world. He could vaguely hear the voices of the people around him, but they were all talking at once, and he couldn't hear them clearly. But at this time, Li Yundong suddenly heard a clear and magnetic middle-aged man's voice coming from a very distant place. "Li Yundong, where did your qi go? Where did your oneness of heaven and man and void in action go?" This voice was like a bolt of lightning cutting through the sky in the darkness, suddenly illuminating Li Yundong's mind. His heart skipped a beat, and he tried to control his scattered yang spirit Jinshin again, slowly summoning them back from all directions. During this process, Li Yundong faintly felt that he seemed to have entered an indescribable realm. It seemed that he had become one with the surrounding world. The vitality and spiritual qi condensed on every flower, grass, tree, and wood in Mount Longhu resonated with him. The surrounding aura, which contained the essence of heaven and earth, slowly flowed into his body. As soon as Li Yundong tried it, the qi and blood in his body immediately became under control. It no longer ran around wildly, and the flowing blood immediately slowed down. Deng Yu and Deng Jiao, who were so anxious that they were crying, immediately became overjoyed and shouted, Okay, quickly apply the medicine." It stopped. Zi Yuan looked and saw that the blood flowing from Li Yundong's wound had slowed down a lot. She was overjoyed and immediately poured the rest of the medicine in the bottle over. At this time, Li Yundong's chest had become like paste, so sticky that Zi Yuan didn't care about the dirt. She applied the powder evenly on Li Yundong's chest with both hands. After her hands were covered in blood, Zi Yuan saw that Li Yundong's wound was finally no longer bleeding. She breathed a sigh of relief, her whole body almost as if it had lost all its strength. When the cultivators of the various sects saw that Li Yundong's blood had stopped flowing, they couldn't help cheering. It's okay. His internal organs weren't hurt, and the bleeding has stopped." At this time, Li Yundong also slowly opened his eyes. The first thing he saw was the girl's pretty face, which was covered in tears. Li Yundong forced a smile, raised his hand to wipe away her tears, and said with a smile, "Fool, how could I leave you behind?" Su-chan smiled, but tears rolled down her cheeks. She held Li Yundong's hand tightly with both hands and pressed it against her cheek. It seemed that as soon as she let go, Li Yundong would disappear. She wanted to say something, but as soon as she opened her mouth, her throat was so choked with sobs that she couldn't say anything. Li Yundong smiled and helped her stroke the hair on her temples. His gaze turned to Zi Yuan, only to see that this fairy-like figure was looking at him with a smile on her face, and there were tears in her eyes. Li Yundong smiled at her and said softly, "Sorry to trouble you." Zi Yuan shook her head quickly, but turned her face to the side and secretly wiped away her tears. Li Yundong finally looked at Xueqi and smiled. "You didn't want to do something stupid just now, did you?" Xueqi's eyes turned red, and she almost cried. She said, "Master, if anything happens to you, I will kill all these Japanese people to avenge you." Li Yundong shook his head and said with a smile, "Don't be silly. If anything happens to you, who will inherit my legacy? Who will pass on my story to future generations?" When Xueqi heard this, she couldn't help but cry. She thought about the scene when she had just met Li Yundong. From his fierce battle with the gangsters at school, to his limelight on the stage, to his battle with Lin Youfa at the school gate, to his lightning strike He Shao, to his fame at the Taoist assembly, to his defeat of Masako Tachibana on Mount Koya, and to his fight against the 3 Jinshin and 1 Thunder Tribulation on Mount Longhu, which shocked the Japanese cultivation world. Zhang Sanfeng, Wang Chongyang, Chen Pu, Bai Yuchan, and Zhang Buduan were all famous cultivators in history. Their deeds had been passed down for thousands of years, and they were still being told by people today. However, the once young boy in front of her had walked step by step. At this time, he had grown into an indomitable great cultivator. Who would remember the story he had experienced in the future, and how would it be recorded? For a moment, Xueqi couldn't help thinking about it. At this time, the people of the Japanese cultivation world couldn't help falling into a depressing silence. Although the cultivators of various sects saw Li Yundong fall to the ground, they were not happy at all. They knew that although Li Yundong was seriously injured and fell to the ground, he had almost completely destroyed the morale of the Japanese cultivation world. He made them realize one thing. In the future, as long as this person was in China, they would always be shrouded in the shadow of this man, and they would never be able to rise again. For the extremely proud and conceited Japanese cultivators, how could they tolerate it? Even Abe, who had always opposed coming to China, said in a sad and heavy voice at this time, "What should we do now? Our failure has created a legend. This legend will be passed down in the world forever, and we will always be the supporting characters and footnotes of that tragedy and shame." As soon as he finished speaking, the cultivator named Otsuka of Deshang sect shouted angrily, "No, we must kill Li Yundong. Otherwise, we will bear this shame forever." Abe was furious and scolded, "Kill him? Then you'll have to bear the infamy of 1,000 years. Otsuka roared loudly, "I'd rather bear this infamy alone than let such a great enemy live in the world." He knelt on the ground with a plop, his back straight, his eyes sweeping across the people present sharply, and he shouted sternly, "I've made up my mind. I've decided to challenge him again. If I'm unfortunate enough to die in battle, I hope that someone will stand up for me. Everyone, we are insignificant, and our reputation is insignificant. But the reputation of the Japanese cultivation world must not be ruined in our hands. Everyone, this is a national war, and we can't afford to lose." As he said this, he bent down heavily, then raised his head with a resolute face. He strode onto the field and shouted in a very stiff Chinese language, "Li Yundong, are you still alive? If you're not dead, do you dare to fight again?" His words made all the cultivators in the Chinese cultivation world fly into a rage. Even an experienced and prudent cultivator like Su Yongzi couldn't help but fly into a rage. He shouted angrily, "You Japanese are too shameless. How can you say such words? There's no need for Zhanren Li to deal with people like you. Come on, let's have a few moves." Zhang Kongyun, Zhang Ling, Du Fei, Wei Qing, Deng Yu, Deng Jiao, and the others were even more furious. They shouted and cursed loudly. For a time, there was a lot of noise and curses on the field. However, Big Mound's expression did not change, as if he could not hear the crowd's tide-like curses. His eyes were like a wolf and an eagle, staring at Li Yundong as if he was staring at his prey. How could Li Yundong not know what the other party was planning? He smiled slightly, but before he could speak, Zi Yuan beside him couldn't help grabbing his arm. Li Yundong turned his head and saw that the beautiful woman was biting her lip hard, her eyebrows full of pleading. She shook her head gently at him, as if she was begging him not to go on the field again. Zhou Qin was also shocked and said in a trembling voice, "Master, this is their provocation. Don't fall for it." Li Yundong smiled and turned to look at Su Chan, only to see that the little girl's tears were rolling down her face. She was just looking at him and didn't say a word. Li Yundong couldn't help but ask with a smile, "Girl, why didn't you persuade me?" Su Chan wiped her tears with the back of her hand, forced a smile, and said in a choked voice, "Yundong, I know what you're thinking. You want to get rid of them once and for all, don't you? You're afraid that we will be implicated in the future, aren't you? If you want to go, go ahead. Anyway, you know that I will always be behind you. No matter what you do, I won't stop you." It was like this in the past, it's like this now, and it will still be like this in the future. Although there was a hole in Li Yundong's chest and he had lost a lot of blood, his heart was warm. He looked at Su Chan gently and reached out to gently caress her face. He looked at her as if there was no one else around and said softly, "Girl, you know me best." He chuckled and said to Su Chan softly, "Help me up." She hastily wiped away the tears on her face and quickly wiped them on her clothes. Then, she gently helped Li Yundong to his feet. At this time, the onlookers were all shocked. They looked at Li Yundong in disbelief, as if they couldn't believe their eyes. This guy, who almost died just now, actually wants to go on the field? Is he crazy? Zhang Kongyun couldn't help but persuade him. "Zhenren Li, there are still cultivators from other sects who can go on the field. Don't force yourself." Mao Yuchang, who was sharp-tongued, also tried to persuade him. "Zhenren Li, don't try to be brave anymore. If you go on the field again, you will die." However, Li Yundong smiled and said softly, "The other party challenged me by name. How can I avoid the battle?" As he said this, he slowly walked to the field. He looked up and down at the grave with a sarcastic smile on his face and said softly, "Hey, a mere young spirit master wants to take advantage of us? Come on, bring it on." Although Li Yundong's words were soft, everyone heard them clearly. For a moment, the field was extremely quiet. The cultivators of all sects in the Japanese cultivation world also looked at Li Yundong with solemn expressions. Their gazes were extremely complicated, with shock, surprise, and a hint of deep awe. Big Mizuka looked at Li Yundong standing in the field. His handsome face was pale, and he was holding his chest with one hand. His body was a little shaky, as if he could be pushed down with a finger. However, he felt that this man, who was about to fall at any time, was as majestic as a mountain, standing in front of him like a towering mountain whose peak could not be seen. Big Mizuka was shocked and thought to himself, "This man is seriously injured to such an extent, but he still has such power. If he survives this, the Japanese cultivation world will really be unable to raise our heads in front of him in the future. Such a terrible enemy must not be allowed to live in this world." Big Mizuka's heart shook, and he let out a beast-like roar. He held a long spear in his hand and slammed the end of the spear heavily on the ground. With a crisp sound, two sharp forks immediately popped out of the tip of the spear. It was the king of spear techniques in Japanese ancient martial arts, treasure yard-style cross spear. Chapter 7:14. Otsuka held the spear with both hands. The tip of the spear was extremely long, about 30 centimeters long. There were blades protruding from the left and right sides of the spear in the shape of a cross, so this spear was also called a cross spear. The spear was about 2.4 meters long, and the tip of the spear was so sharp that it seemed to pierce through the air. In particular, the body of the spear was covered with exquisite talisman patterns, which were obviously imprinted with some kind of powerful magic circle. Otsuka stared at Li Yundong and said stiffly, "Zhenren Li, my spear was once used by Sanada Yukimura as a personal weapon. It has killed countless people and drunk their blood. Today, you will be one of the souls killed by this spear." Li Yundong had been seriously injured before and had lost too much blood. His face looked as pale as paper, and his feet were weak. Only his eyes were still bright, but they had lost a lot of spirit. He smiled slightly and said, "It turns out to be Sanada Yukimura's personal weapon. You have to be careful not to end up like him." While the two of them were talking on the field, Deng Yu and Deng Jiao asked in a low voice, "Who is Sanada Yukimura?" Zhang Lufang had explained a lot of things to them before, so she didn't mind explaining it again. She said in a low voice, Sanada Yukimura was a famous samurai in the late Warring States period of Japan. He once fought his way into Tokugawa Ieyasu's formation with a cross spear in his hand during the Battle of Osaka. He fought so hard that Tokugawa Ieyasu almost committed suicide. Although Sanada Yukimura died in the battle due to his lack of physical strength, Tokugawa Ieyasu had to praise him as the strongest soldier in Japan after he narrowly escaped death. Deng Yu looked at Otsuka's spear curiously and then looked at Li Yundong worriedly. The weapon of the strongest soldier in Japan must be very powerful, right? Zhang Lufang said nervously in a low voice, "I don't know, but if Li Yundong hadn't been injured, I believe that such a person wouldn't be in his eyes at all, but now." As she said this, she looked at Li Yundong worriedly and couldn't bear to say the rest of her words. At this time, Otsuka held a long spear in his hand and shouted loudly. He quickly rushed toward Li Yundong. His body was extremely low, and the tip of the spear was pointing down at Li Yundong's lower abdomen. He rushed over with a fierce gust of wind. Everyone saw that the steel spear in Otsuka's hand was emitting bursts of light, and the spear seemed to have turned into a fierce dragon. It was aggressive and powerful. It was the secret skill of the cross spear of the treasury yard. This move was fierce and could instantly kill birds in the sky. In his eyes, the spear of Otsuka was so fierce that it could kill a bird. In his view, Otsuka of the spear. However, after he stabbed the spear at Li Yundong's lower abdomen, he saw that Li Yundong was still covering his chest with one hand, and the fingers of the other hand were spread out. His fingers accurately leaned against the side of the tip of the spear, and then with a gentle flick, the fierce spear, which was like a tornado, was pushed away. The founder of the treasury yard was Yin Rong, the head of the treasury of the Xingfu Temple of the Dharma characteristic sect in Japan. Yin Rong loved martial arts and was recognized as one of the 2 martial monks with the highest level of martial arts in Japanese history. His cultivation had reached the peak of Dharma seal. The founder of the treasury yard was Yin Rong, the head of the treasury yard of the Xingfu Temple of the Dharma characteristic sect in Japan. Yin Rong loved martial arts and was recognized as one of the 2 martial monks with the highest level of martial arts in Japanese history. His cultivation had reached the peak of the Dharma seal realm. He had once created the cross spear by observing the bright moon in the pond. The most famous part of this spear technique was its incantation: stab into a spear, slash into a razor, and cut into a hook and sickle. Ordinary people would usually be able to defend against the first thrust of the spear, but after that, the spear wielder would only need to drag the spear back slightly, and the cross-shaped body of the spear would be able to easily cut the opponent. Moreover, this move of turning the wrist and retracting the spear was extremely fast, like a flash of lightning, and even ghosts and gods would be able to guard against it. But no matter how fast the wrist and the spear were, it could not be faster than the speed of a finger. Li Yundong didn't even look at it. It was as if there were eyes all over his body. He accurately flicked his finger under the spear, and with a clang, the spear was once again deflected. Big Mound was shocked again. In a rage, he stabbed the spear in his hand and attacked Li Yundong from all directions like a storm. Everyone saw that his spear was as fast as lightning. It stabbed, hooked, curled, cut, lifted, cut, chopped and slashed. Every move was fierce and sharp, and the spear was almost like a shadow. But Li Yundong still stood in the same place. One hand was covering the wound on his chest, and the other hand was gently raised in front of him. He didn't even raise his arm. He just kept moving his 5 fingers. Looking from afar, everyone felt that Li Yundong's movements did not seem to be fast, but he was able to easily deflect the opponent's attack with each move. Sometimes, it even seemed as if De Jong had stretched out the least lethal part of the spear to Li Yundong's fingers for him to flick. Big Mound was shocked and angry at the same time. He couldn't help but let out a roar, and the spear in his hand danced wildly. His whole body and the spear became a black shadow. The air was filled with the sound of his spear tearing through the air. It was shocking, like a ghost dancing in the air. However, Li Yundong remained motionless. One of his hands was placed in front of his chest, and his 5 fingers were impenetrable. No matter how fierce De Mound's attacks were, he was like a small boat floating in the raging waves, never capsizing. The onlookers were dazzled, and their mouths were wide open. They couldn't believe that this man who was standing tall was actually seriously injured. At this time, Li Yundong was anxious when he saw that Big Mound's attacks were not successful. Although his attacks were getting fiercer and fiercer, his strength was also getting harder and harder. He aimed at the moment when Big Mound's spear was about to stab him. He suddenly flicked the spear with his finger. With a clang, the spear shook violently. Big Mound felt a huge force coming at him, and the spear almost fell out of his hand. Shocked, he immediately tightened his grip on the spear, and the force bounced back. But at this moment, Li Yundong flicked the tip of the spear again. The two opposing forces collided, and with a clang, the tip of the spear broke into two pieces. Big Mound's expression changed, and he was stunned. However, at this moment, his hand was empty, and the cross-shaped spear was easily caught by Li Yundong. Li Yundong held the spear with one hand, and looked at the broken spear with a smile. He said softly, "Although the spear is good, it reeks of blood. It's not auspicious. I think it's better not to leave such an inauspicious thing in this world." As he spoke, he exerted a little force with his two fingers and slowly broke the body of the spear like cutting a branch. Finally, he folded the spear into a bare iron rod and threw it toward Big Mound. Big Mound subconsciously caught the spear. He looked at the bare iron rod in his hand in a daze, unable to speak for a long time. After a long time he screamed, bent the iron rod with both hands, and threw it into the distance. His face was blue and red as he ran out of the arena. The cultivators on the sidelines were all silent for a moment. Everyone looked at Li Yundong with a complicated look in their eyes. They couldn't imagine how a cultivator who had been seriously injured could still have such power. At this time, most of the Japanese cultivators had been shocked by Li Yundong. Even those who wanted to fight couldn't help but start to retreat. Of course, as Big Mound had said, this battle could be called a national war, and they couldn't afford to lose. But at this time, they had risked the world's condemnation to challenge a seriously injured opponent. If they won, it would be fine. But if they lost, they would really be unable to raise their heads for the rest of their lives. After Big Mound was defeated, he couldn't restrain his shame and left in a hurry. For a moment, the cultivators of all the sects in Japan felt sorry for each other. They looked at each other and didn't want to fight again. Seeing this scene, Isi Shinguang couldn't help but let out a long sigh and said with emotion, "He's really a god. To have such a person as an opponent is both a great fortune and a great misfortune for our generation." Isi Izumo's eyes were filled with amazement. She had never seen a man as brave as Li Yundong. She said in a low voice, "It's a pity that I can't have a fair fight with him. This will be my lifelong regret." Isi Shinguang reacted keenly. He looked at Isi Chuyun in surprise and asked, "Are you going to fight?" Isi Chuyun nodded slowly. She stared at Li Yundong and said in a low voice, "We can't let such an opponent live in this world. He's too terrible." Isi Shinguang nodded gently and said, "Even a lion needs to go all out to fight a rabbit. Chuyun, go and end all this." Isi Chuyun nodded slightly. She gently moved her feet and slowly walked into the field. She said softly, "I'm Isi Chuyun from the Ise Shinto. I want to see Li Jun's kung fu." As soon as she finished speaking, Zhou Qin suddenly shouted angrily, "You guys are so shameless. Even if you win in this way, what's there to show off? What's there to be proud of? It's glorious." At this time, the Chinese cultivators also shouted loudly, "That's right. There are so many of you. If you fight one by one, how long will it take? If you have the ability, come and fight with me. Why are you always staring at Zhenren Li?" Isi Chiyun glanced at the side of the field. Her expression was cold, but her eyes were extremely bright and sharp. She said in a clear voice, "Li Jun, I promise you that I will be the last challenger. If you defeat me, we will immediately turn around and leave. In the future, as long as you are in China, we will never set foot in China again. What do you think?" At this time, Li Yundong's chest was injured, and he could barely muster any strength in his body. Earlier, he had used his 5 fingers to defend against De Mound's repeated attacks, and he had relied on his kung fu to overcome De Mound's strength with ease. However, when he had snatched the spear, his movements had been a little too forceful, and it had immediately caused a sharp pain in his chest. His throat felt salty, as if he was about to vomit blood. Li Yundong swallowed the blood back, but his throat was so dry that he couldn't speak for a while. He looked at Esichiyun in front of him, and a thought suddenly flashed through his mind. This Ise Chuyun is probably the strongest cultivator in this group of people. She actually appeared at this time and used such words to provoke me, making it impossible for me to avoid. It seems that I'm going to die this time. As soon as this thought flashed through his mind, he heard the magnetic voice of a middle-aged man coming from afar. Li Yundong, these Japanese Ise Shinto goddesses seem to be powerful, but in fact, they are strong in appearance and weak in reality. They are easy to deal with. Don't be afraid of her. This was the second time Li Yunyong had heard this voice. He turned his head in surprise and looked around, but he didn't find anything unusual. He was surprised and doubtful in his heart. Who is the person who sent me the voice transmission? Chapter 7:15. This mysterious voice was not only very magnetic, but also very soft and pleasant to listen to. It was full of intellectual gentleness, making people feel like they were bathing in the spring breeze. Li Yundong suddenly heard the mysterious voice transmission and couldn't help looking around. But as soon as he glanced around, the middle-aged man's voice rang in his ears again. Although the witches of the Shintoism are powerful, they cultivate their nature, not their fate. Moreover, they are born with 5 leakage bodies and never repair them, let alone Juji phase. Therefore, although the Shikigami she summons and the powerful magical weapons she uses are powerful, once they fight, they can attack her body fiercely. They use such powerful magic with their 5 leakage bodies, and they are the biggest flaw. Li Yundong smiled bitterly in his heart. It's difficult for me to take a step now, let alone attack fiercely. I'm afraid that if I use my strength now, I will immediately bleed to death. But the person who had sent the voice transmission seemed to know what he was thinking and said, point at the Zigong, Yutong, Shanzhong, and Huagai acupoints on your chest, and then point at the Ruzhong, Rugan, Chihu, Kufang, Chimen, and Ryu acupoints. Then store qi in your lower dantian. When you circulate it, control the qi and blood of your whole body and don't go to the ran and du meridians. In this way, you can ensure that when you attack your opponent fiercely later, you won't bleed for about a minute. Li Yundong was shocked. He knew that the acupoint control method that the other party had told him was very strange. Even someone like him, who had read a lot of books, had never seen it. He hesitated for a moment, but then he heard the voice say with a smile, "Why, don't you believe me?" Li Yundong smiled bitterly in his heart. It's so inconvenient to not know how to use voice transmission. Only others can talk to me privately, but I can't take the initiative to talk to others. Ha! Wait. Li Yundong's heart suddenly skipped a beat. Voice transmission? I remember Zi Yuan once said that voice transmission seems to be the unique secret skill of the Linggong sect. This person. Could it be Wang Yuanshan? As soon as this thought flashed through Li Yundong's mind, he was immediately shocked. Wang Yuanshan is not dead? Zi Yuan. Does she know? Just as Li Yunyang was about to look at Zi Yuan subconsciously, he saw that Ise Chuyun, who was not far away, had taken out a white flag from her wide sleeve. She waved the white flag softly and muttered something in a low voice, as if she was chanting something. Her feet were light and strange, as if she was carrying out some mysterious sacrificial activity. He calmed himself down and temporarily put his worries aside. His fingers quickly pressed several acupoints on his chest according to the instructions given to him by the mysterious man. As soon as he pressed on the wound, he immediately felt a numbness in his chest. He couldn't feel any pain from the wound at all. Most importantly, when he circulated his qi a little, he felt as if all the qi in his body had bypassed the area around the wound, forming a vacuum zone where qi and blood didn't circulate. Li Yundong knew that once a Jinshin master's chest or waist was broken by the opponent, it meant that his Jinshin was broken. Not only would he no longer have a strong Jinshin protection, but it would also be extremely difficult for him to circulate his qi and blood normally. The reason why the Jinshin was so strong was that cultivators could constantly compress their aura in their bodies through their leakless body. The stronger a cultivator's body was, the stronger his cauldron would be. The greater the pressure in the sealed cauldron, the stronger the power of the Jinshin would be and the more condensed it would be. However, once a cultivator's body was injured, it meant that the cultivator was no longer a leakless body. Once they tried to compress and condense this Zhenqi, it would automatically leak out from the wound. Therefore the power of Jinshin could not condense and take shape. But at this time, after Li Yundong pressed these acupoints on his chest, it was as if an isolation zone had been created near his wound. His chi and blood didn't pass through this place. Li Yundong was surprised, and he could clearly feel that his zhenqi and strength were slowly recovering in his body. As for Ise Chuyun, she was still waving the white flag in her hand and didn't notice the change in Li Yundong at all. After she gracefully danced for a while, she suddenly raised the white banner in her hand into the air and shouted a few times. Immediately after, the sky seemed to split open, and a dazzling seven-colored divine light suddenly fell from it. This light shone straight on Ise Chuyun's body. Suddenly, her clothes fluttered without any wind, and her long black hair, which was like a waterfall, flew up. Her eyes shot out two sharp rays of light that were as dazzling as light, and there was no longer any color in her originally dark pupils. When the cultivators of the various sects of the Japanese Shintoism saw Ise Chuyun's majestic aura, they all looked in awe. Some of them even knelt down to worship Ise Chuyun. Deng Yu, who was standing to one side, felt strange and asked in a low voice, "What are they worshipping? Is this Japanese girl very powerful?" Zhang Kongyun said in a deep voice with a serious face, "They're not worshipping this girl, but Amaterasu, the highest god of the Japanese Shintoism." While they were talking, they saw a beautiful woman with a yellow belt on her forehead slowly descending from the sky. She was wearing a long yellow robe and a blue belt around her waist, holding a golden long sword in her hand. The woman's body was shining like the sun, and she stood high behind Ise Chuyun. At this time, Ise Chuyun's face was no longer as cold and elegant as before. At this time, the blue veins on her temples were bulging, and her neck seemed to be crawling with small cyan snakes. The chi and blood in her body were boiling to the extreme. She pointed at Li Yundong and shouted, "The sun rises in the east, and the divine light shines." Ise Chuyun's voice was like the shouts of millions of believers at the same time, echoing in the valley of Mount Longhu. Amaterasu, who was standing behind Ise Chuyun, was even more dazzling. The people outside the field were hurt by the dazzling light, and those who were slightly weaker even shed tears and didn't dare to look anymore. Li Yunyang had once fought with Yu Shang, who had strong eyesight, and had seen his eyes as dazzling as the sun. However, Yu Shang's ability was far inferior to Ise Chuyun's. With Yu Shang's strength, an ordinary person could be scared to death by his glare. At this time, Ise Chuyun was 100 times more powerful than him. Li Yundong's eyes narrowed into a line in an instant. Even with his cultivation, he didn't dare to look directly at this dazzling light. He knew that Amaterasu was the sun goddess of the Japanese Shintoism. Her godhood was extremely high and her magic was extremely powerful. Moreover, Amaterasu was standing behind Ise Chuyun. If he suddenly attacked at this time, he was afraid that Amaterasu would split him in two with one sword, let alone attack Ise Chuyun's body. Li Yundong thought to himself, "I have to lure Amaterasu away as soon as possible. Otherwise, I will never be able to get close to Ise Chuyun. If I can't even get close, how can I attack?" Li Yundong's heart skipped a beat, and his mind raced. He quickly retreated as if he was going to escape. Yun raised her head and laughed. At this time, she was already a demigod, and her personality had changed greatly. She pointed at Li Yundong from afar and shouted sternly, "The sun is shining at the ends of the earth. Where can you run to?" As soon as she finished speaking, Amaterasu behind her disappeared in an instant and slashed at Li Yundong with her sword. As soon as Amaterasu's sword fell, there was a terrible sound in the air, as if a piece of cloth had been torn apart. The air in front of Li Yundong was severely distorted, and an invisible black hole seemed to have been cut open by this sword. If he was slightly touched by it, he would immediately be sucked into it. Li Yundong's hair stood on end. At this time, he retreated rapidly, but it was no longer a pretense. He ran as far as he could like a bolt of lightning. Amaterasu's sword missed, and she was immediately furious. She raised her hand and slashed again. This sword with a loud bang, shook the mountains, cracked the earth, and cracked the rocks. Its power was extremely terrifying. Everyone saw that Li Yundong was being beaten back step by step, and there was no room for him to fight back at all. Ise Chuyun's strength showed an astonishing overwhelming advantage on the field. Su Chan, who was on the sidelines, didn't dare to watch anymore. She put her palms together, closed her eyes, and began to recite the Buddhist scriptures in a low voice. The poor little girl's voice trembled. At this time, she had completely forgotten the scriptures she had memorized. She just kept chanting the words Amitabha in a low voice. Xueqi was as anxious as an ant on a hot pan. She wished she could rush up and replace Li Yundong. Zi Yuan, on the other hand, stared at the field. Although there was no expression on her face, her mind was quickly thinking about the countermeasures in front of her, trying to think of a way to solve this dilemma for Li Yundong. But even though she was usually resourceful, her mind was empty at this time, and she had no idea at all. When the cultivators of the Japanese sects saw that Ise Chuyun was suppressing Li Yundong and beating him up, they didn't look happy at all. It was as if they had already expected this scene. In their opinion, Ise Chuyun was a rare genius in the Japanese cultivation world. If she couldn't win against a seriously injured Li Yundong with all her might, then the sun would rise from the west. The Japanese cultivation world was very quiet, and the Chinese cultivation world was even more mournful. At this time, everyone could see that there was no chance for Li Yunyang to make a comeback in this battle. Ise Chuyun's advantage was too great, and he didn't have the slightest intention of underestimating his opponent. There was no chance at all. But just as the Chinese cultivators looked up to the sky and sighed, Li Yundong had unknowingly led Amaterasu to the side of the field, far away from Ise Chuyun. Just as Amaterasu's sword slashed down again, Li Yundong's zhenqi suddenly poured out like a flood. This heat flowed through his limbs in an instant, and the power ran through his whole body. His head and tail trembled violently. Li Yundong stamped his feet and rushed toward Ise Chuyun like a cannonball. At this moment, Li Yundong's qi and blood suddenly surged and condensed into a ball. The power of his jinshin burst out, and he instantly got rid of Amaterasu in front of him. In the blink of an eye, he had rushed to Ise Chuyun's face. He turned his hand and slapped Ise Chuyun's face with his palm. This time, everyone was dumbfounded, and everyone cried out in surprise. Ise Chuyun hadn't expected Li Yundong to have such amazing strength. She felt as if she had seen a dead corpse suddenly come back to life, and her face changed dramatically. She quickly took out 3 talismans from her sleeve and threw them at Li Yundong. As soon as the 3 talismans left her hand, they immediately turned into 3 fierce shikigami and rushed toward Li Yundong. Li Yundong quickly made 3 Mahamudra with both hands. It was the Vairocana Dharma boundary print, the lotus palm print, and the void hiding print. He shouted sternly, "Break! Break! Break!" The 3 Mahamudra slammed into the 3 shikigami. Suddenly, there were 3 loud bangs that shook heaven and earth, and the 3 shikigami were instantly smashed into pieces. At this time, Li Yundong had almost used all his strength. He knew that his life or death depended on this blow. He didn't stop. He rushed to Ise Chuyun like a meteor and slapped her on the top of her head. Although Ise Chuyun was powerful, she cultivated nature instead of life. Her physical combat ability was almost zero, and her spiritual power was limited because she was a 5-leak body. She couldn't form a strong zhenqi like jinshin to protect her body. Therefore, at this time, she watched Li Yundong pounce on her with her mouth agape. There was no way for her to resist at all. She could only watch Li Yundong's palm get closer and closer to the top of her head, covering the sky and earth. Just as Li Yundong's palm was about to fall, Amaterasu instantly rushed behind Li Yundong and slashed at his back with his sword. At this moment, everyone on the sidelines almost suffocated. They all thought at the same time, is Li Yundong going to die together with Ise Chuyun in this desperate fight? Chapter 7:16. Just as Li Yundong's palm was about to hit Ise Chuyun, both Ise Chuyun himself and the cultivators of the various sects on the sidelines felt that time seemed to have stopped moving at this moment. They all stared at Li Yundong's palm slowly falling down with wide eyes. A few sharp lights suddenly flew out of the 7 treasure bag on Li Yundong's waist. It was the psychic fan of 7 treasures, the Bahuang sword, the Lyoha sword, and the burning thumb pot. They jumped up at the same time and rushed toward the long sword in Amaterasu's hand. The pupils in Ise Izumo's eyes narrowed instantly. At that moment, she felt despair as she felt the approach of death and the ferocity of the Grim Reaper. She knew that as long as these treasures could stop the Amaterasu god for even a second, she would be dead. Ise Izumo watched helplessly as Li Yundong's palm covered all the world in front of her and slammed toward her. But just when she thought that she was going to die, she suddenly saw Li Yundong's palm suddenly hovering less than a centimeter above her forehead, and it didn't go down anymore. At this moment, the long sword in Amaterasu's hand collided with the 4 powerful magical weapons. With a clang, the 4 powerful magical weapons were immediately knocked away, and the long sword in Amaterasu's hand was also shaken up. But just as she was about to continue slashing down, her movement suddenly stopped, as if her whole body had been petrified in an instant. Aisachun stared at the palm above her head. Her arrogant face slowly became calm, and the amazing light and momentum around her gradually dissipated. The Amaterasu she had summoned also twisted and turned into countless dazzling rays of light that shot in all directions. Ise Chuyun also regained her original cold expression. She said lightly, "Why didn't you slap down?" Li Yundong stared at Ise Chuyun for a long time. Suddenly, he smiled and said, "Do you know what the result will be if I slap down?" Ise Izumo glanced at the palm on his forehead and said in an incongruous manner, "Your palm isn't that big either." Although Ise Izumo's words were somewhat irrelevant, he was more or less unwilling to admit defeat, and there was a hint of stubbornness in his words. At this time, Li Yundong only felt that the sealed acupoints in his chest were becoming more and more swollen and stinging. He couldn't help coughing and chuckling. Although the palm is not big, it's enough to cover the sky. Isachumo's body shook slightly. She looked at Li Yunyang with a complicated look in her eyes for a long time before she let out a long breath. She slowly bowed and said respectfully, "I lost." Li Yundong smiled slightly, and the murderous intent in his eyes gradually dissipated. He nodded slowly and heavily. "Remember what you said before." After he finished speaking, he suddenly spat out a mouthful of blood and fell backwards. The mountain-like man finally collapsed. A series of battles that concerned the cultivation world of China and Japan had finally come to an end with Ise Izumi admitting defeat. There was a dead silence among the cultivators of the Japanese cultivation world, but at this time, no one was clamoring to clear the name of the Japanese cultivation world and wash away their shame. The Japanese had one of the biggest characteristics. When they encountered a powerful enemy, they would often feel humiliated and angry, and then rise up to challenge them. They would charge forward without any regard for their own safety, and in the end, they would even die together. However, once they found that the strong person they encountered was far beyond their imagination, their humiliation and anger would immediately turn into extreme fear and worship. In 663 AD, the Tang dynasty in Japan had a decisive battle at the mouth of the Baijiang River on the Korean peninsula. At that time, Lu Rengui, a famous general of the Tang dynasty, led 7,000 Tang troops and more than 170 ships to fight against 40,000 Japanese troops and more than 1,000 warships, and finally wiped out the Japanese navy. After this battle, Emperor Tenji of Japan submitted to Emperor Gaozong of the Tang dynasty. For nearly 1,000 years, Japan had not dared to look directly at China. At this time, the shock that Li Yundong gave to the Japanese cultivation world was no less than that of the battle at the mouth of the Baijiang River more than 1,000 years ago. They could not imagine how such a young cultivator could be so strong and reach such a realm. Li Yundong in front of them had killed Takahashi Shoda, defeated Abe Yuji, defeated Imagawa Kagumo, killed Saionji Tsunekatsu, defeated Otsuka, and finally reversed the situation of Ise Izumi when he was seriously injured and waiting to die. This had simply exceeded their imagination and cognitive ability. At this time, what the cultivators of all sects in Japan felt was no longer humiliation and anger, but deep awe and worship. The Japanese people worshipped the strong, especially the tragic and strong. Although they were from different camps, at this time, they were all full of inexplicable respect for the man in front of them who had fought continuously. Ise Izumi was spat out a mouthful of blood by Li Yundong, and her cold face was stained with blood. Surprisingly, she did not frown and reach out to wipe it. She just looked at Li Yundong with a complicated look in her eyes, and then looked at the few women who were crazily rushing toward him. She sighed softly, turned around, and walked to the side of the field. Izumi walked up to Ise Shinguang, bowed slightly, and said softly, "I'm sorry to disappoint you." Ise Shinguang put his hands in front of his chest and still looked a little careless, but his expression was full of emotion. He said in a low voice, "I originally thought that the leaders of the major cultivation sects in China would have a fierce confrontation with us. No matter what the result was, it would have been a fierce battle that could be recorded in history. But I didn't expect that the leaders of these Chinese sects would cherish their feathers too much. Among the 3,000 cultivators in China, only this person is a hero. We were originally going to fight against the mystical silver fox, but the battle actually made Li Yundong his invincible reputation. What a pity, respect and fear." He looked at Li Yundong, who was lying on the ground, in awe and said with emotion, "This person is the reincarnation of Wisdom King, and he is invincible in fighting. He really deserves to be called the Fighting Heavenly Lord." It's an honor for me to be defeated by him. After sighing with emotion, he turned to Ise Shenguang and said, Shenguang Jun, what should we do now? Ise Kenko glanced at Ase Izumo helplessly. He seemed to be a little dissatisfied with how confident she was before, but he also knew that he couldn't blame Ise Izumo. At that time, even he thought that Ise Izumo would definitely win. But who knew that Li Yundong was like a ghost or a god? Under such circumstances, he could still turn the tide. This made it impossible for him to blame him. Ise Shenguang sighed softly and whispered to the depressed cultivators of the various sects. Everyone, the facts are in front of us. This time we have completely lost. Before he could finish his words, someone straightened his neck, panted heavily, and said painfully, Shenguang Jun, are we going back like this? Ise Shenguang sighed and said, I know what you are thinking, but we didn't lose to these ancient sects in the Chinese cultivation world. We lost to the immovable Wisdom King, his reincarnation, Li Yundong. As soon as he said this, the cultivators of the other sects suddenly looked much better, but someone said in a low voice, but, what about the mystical silver fox? Can it be that as long as Li Yundong is here, we will leave the mystical silver fox alone? Ise Shenguang was silent for a long time, and then he said slowly, Everyone, I believe you all know that the mystical silver fox and the immovable Wisdom King are mortal enemies. If the mystical silver fox wants to take revenge, maybe she will choose a target that is easier to take revenge on, such as a seriously injured reincarnated Wisdom King. Even if the mystical silver fox doesn't find trouble with the reincarnated Wisdom King, we are not necessarily afraid of her. We could seal her up in the past, and we can still do it now. As long as she comes again, we will definitely make her unable to return. Ise Shenguang's words made the cultivators of all sects turn around in anger, and their faces were full of spirit. They all seemed to have found a way out of the stage and said, Shenguang Jun, well said. That's right, that makes sense. Yes, we lost to the reincarnated Wisdom King, not to the Chinese cultivation world. They were in a mess. Suddenly, Hideyoshi of the Tiantai sect, who had been reciting scriptures on the sidelines, suddenly opened his eyes and stood up. He scolded sternly, You timid guys, how dare you succumb to the despotic power of a boy? His stern shout suddenly made the faces of the others change greatly. Abe Yoli's face darkened and he said angrily, Hideyoshi, what did you say? Have you ever seen a boy like Li Yundong? Even Imagawa Kagumo doesn't dare to say that he can defeat so many of us in a row. As soon as he said this, the other cultivators echoed loudly. Hideyoshi looked at them angrily. He gritted his teeth and picked up the golden body of Imagawa Kagumo. Finally, he glanced at them gloomily, as if he wanted to remember them all in his eyes. He turned around and strode down the mountain. The other monks of the Tiantai sect also followed him down the mountain with their injured companions in their arms. Kaisai Hikaryuni of the Zhenyan Tantrism, who had been silent all this time, sighed deeply. He put his palms together and chanted the name of Buddha, Amitba, I've sinned. After that, he slowly turned around and walked down the mountain. The other cultivators of the Zhenyan Tantrism left with him one after another. More than half of the cultivators of all sects had left. Compared with the mighty situation when they came, they were really lonely. Ise Shenko, Abe Yuri, and the others looked at each other, sighed softly, and left one after another. At this time, Su Chan, Zi Yuan, Zhou Qin, and the others had already surrounded Li Yundong anxiously, especially Su Chan. When she saw Li Yundong fall again, she was shocked and rushed to Li Yundong in the blink of an eye. She saw that there was blood in front of Li Yundong, his eyes were closed, his lips were purple gold, and his expression was very frightening. She suddenly felt a pain in her heart and immediately squatted down to feel Li Yundong's pulse. But when she touched it, she immediately felt that there was no pulse in Li Yundong's body. This time, Su Chan was so shocked that she froze on the spot. Her body involuntarily trembled violently. Her lips trembled slightly, and her eyes stared straight at Li Yundong. Her eyes were empty, and her whole body seemed to have left her body. When Zi Yuan and Zhou Qin, who had rushed over, saw Su Chan like this, their hearts sank. They hurriedly checked Li Yundong's pulse, and when they did, they were all stunned on the spot, tears streaming down their cheeks. Zhou Qin said in a trembling voice, Master, don't scare me. I'll kill all these Japanese for you and avenge you. As soon as she moved, Zi Yuan grabbed her. Zhou Qin suddenly turned her head and shouted in a hoarse voice, Ziyuan, let go. Tears kept rolling in Ziyuan's eyes. She smiled bitterly and shook her head. Her expression was stubborn, and she looked at Zhou Qin's sharp eyes without showing any sign of weakness. The two of them confronted each other, but Su Chan was already crying like a pear blossom in the rain. She sobbed and said, Yundong, you didn't keep your word. You said you wouldn't leave me behind. How could you? Before she could finish her words, she suddenly heard Li Yundong's soft and helpless voice. You guys are so noisy. Su Chan's crying stopped abruptly. She took a deep breath and opened her small mouth into an O shape. There were still tears on her face, and she stared at Li Yundong with her eyes wide open. Her eyes were filled with unspeakable surprise, ecstasy, doubt, and confusion. Zhou Qin also stared at Li Yundong and said tentatively, Master, you're not dead? Ziyuan also involuntarily let go of Zhou Qin's hand and looked at Li Yundong with her mouth open and tongue-tied. It was really a wonderful scene for a fairy like her to be so surprised. Li Yundong pressed the wound on his chest with one hand and said in a low voice, Evil disciple, do you really want me to die? So that you can inherit my inheritance in the future? At this moment, both Zhou Qin and Ziyuan wanted to laugh, but they didn't dare to. Zhou Qin suppressed her surprise and laughter and said embarrassedly, Master. I thought. Before she could finish her words, Li Yundong sighed and said, What do you mean? Can't I sleep for a while? You guys are really noisy. As soon as Li Yundong's voice fell, Su Chan suddenly cheered and threw herself on Li Yundong. She burst into tears and said, Yundong, you scared me to death. I thought you were dead. As soon as she threw herself on him, the wound on Li Yundong's chest suddenly ruptured. He felt a sharp pain all over his body, and his eyes darkened. The corners of his mouth twitched. He struggled and said, Stop, stop. Stop it. If you don't stop, I will really die. After saying this, his eyes darkened, his head tilted, and he fainted. At this time, there were still some Japanese cultivators who had not left. When they saw this scene, they felt very upset in their hearts. The newly born Heavenly Master Battler had not been knocked unconscious in a series of fierce battles, but at this time, Su Chan was so excited that he immediately fainted. It was really that even heroes had a weakness for a beautiful woman. Well, I came back from Beijing today. I was a little in a hurry, so I was late. Sorry. There will be another update later. Chapter 717. Su Chan saw that she had pounced on Li Yundong, causing his chest to bleed again. Her eyes rolled back and she fainted. She was shocked and quickly stood up straight. She looked at Li Yundong in a daze, then tentatively poked his arm with her fingers and said in a trembling voice, Master, are you okay? Zhou Qin and Ziyuan also looked at Li Yundong with their mouths agape. They really hadn't recovered from the surprise, so extreme joy turned to sorrow. They checked Li Yundong again in a hurry. This time, Ziyuan saw through it. She breathed a sigh of relief in her heart and couldn't help but smile. It's okay. Just now, Li Yundong didn't catch his breath and faked his death. But his cultivation is profound, and it only took a while for him to adjust himself. However, just now Su Chan. His wound ruptured, his breath became chaotic, and he fainted again. Su Chan was also relieved, but her face was full of embarrassment and sadness. She lowered her head and her chin almost buried in her chest. She whispered, I didn't do it on purpose. I. The more she spoke, the more anxious she became, and tears kept welling up in her eyes. Seeing that she was about to cry again, Ziyuan quickly smiled bitterly and said, Su Chan, it's normal for you to react like this. It's not your fault. With Li Yundong's cultivation, as long as his internal organs and tendons are not hurt, he will be fine. He will be fine after resting for a while. At this time, Zhou Qin was also relieved. She glanced around and saw that the Japanese cultivators were leaving one after another. She raised her eyebrows and snorted coldly. These Japanese still want to leave? It's not that easy. Before she caught up, Ziyuan, who was beside her, hurriedly advised, Zhou Qin, don't chase a cornered enemy. At this time, it's better to avoid trouble. Previously, I.C. Chuyun made a vow that as long as he was defeated by Li Yundong, as long as Li Yundong was alive, they would never set foot on the mainland of China again. Don't force them into a corner. Otherwise, a cornered dog will jump over the wall. How could Xueqi not know this? She was just angry that these Japanese people had swaggered over to fight with them and then left after failing. Although the Japanese cultivation world had paid a heavy price in the Battle of Mount Longhu, with 2 Jinshin and 1 Thunder Tribulation dead, in Xueqi's opinion, even a hair on Li Yundong's body was 100 times more precious than them, not to mention that he had been seriously injured by them and was now unconscious. Xueqi glared at the Japanese resentfully and snorted. "They're lucky. Humph, I'll settle this score with them sooner or later." At this time, the inauguration ceremony of the Linggong sect had been messed up by this group of Japanese. The cultivation world of China and Japan had been in a mess, and each sect had suffered casualties. Zhang Ling and the others of the Xueqi school, who had originally wanted to make things difficult for the Linggong sect at the inauguration ceremony, didn't know what to do when they saw this situation. In particular, Zhang Tongtian, Zhang Huashuai, and the others of the Qingqing sect had originally wanted to make things difficult for Li Yundong at the inauguration ceremony, but in turn, they owed Li Yundong a favor. Although Zhang Huashui's eyes had been hurt by Takahashi Shota's spray before, he had listened in all directions and understood the situation on the field. At this time, he gradually calmed down. He turned to Zhang Tongtian and said, "Senior brother, what should we do now?" Zhang Tongtian stared at the unconscious Li Yundong and sighed in a deep voice with a complicated look in his eyes. "Xixiang, there must be something fishy about the night massacre of Qingqing Mountain. I don't think Li Yundong is a person who can do such a cruel thing." Although Zhang Huashuai couldn't see Li Yundong's previous fighting methods with his naked eyes, his cultivation quotient and yang spirit were still there. He also knew how fierce and shocking Li Yundong's previous fierce battles were. Therefore, even a proud and hot-tempered man like him couldn't help but admire him. Zhang Huashuai nodded. "Xixiang, what you said makes sense. Let's investigate this matter again. However, I always feel that it must have something to do with the Fox Zen School. Maybe in the end, after investigating, I'm afraid it will still fall on this guy." Zhang Tongtian was silent. After a while he said, "Let's not worry about that for now. Although Li Wudi is powerful, our Qingqing sect is not useless. Let's go back." Zhang Huashuai hesitated for a moment and asked, "Then, what about the inauguration ceremony of the Linggong sect?" Zhang Tongtian snorted. "Can you still do it in such a situation? Let's go. This matter must have been ruined now. There's no point in staying any longer." Zhang Huashuai had always followed his senior brother's lead. He responded and followed his senior brother to Zhang Ling and the others. They greeted Zhang Ling and the others with their disciples and grand disciples, then went down the mountain noisily. As soon as they left, many people from the Maoshan sect, Chuanjin Dragon sect, and other sects also left. Although Du Fei, Wei Qing, Yu Shang, Mao Yuchang, and the others wanted to say a few words to Li Yundong, he was unconscious at this time, so it was not appropriate for them to go forward and talk to Su Chan, Zi Yuan, and the others rashly. They could only look at them from afar and go down the mountain. After Zhang Ling said goodbye to these people one by one, she looked at Zi Yuan helplessly. Her eyes flickered. After a long time, she said in a deep voice, "Zhenren Zi Yuan." Hearing her words, Zi Yuan's heart trembled. She straightened up, bowed to her and said, "The Zhenren of the earthly fire, what can I do for you?" Zhang Ling said, "Today's inauguration ceremony was supposed to punish you according to the rules of our Xueqi school, but so many things have happened, so the ceremony has been cancelled halfway. Although the ceremony was cancelled today, it doesn't mean that it will be abandoned forever. Our Xueqi school will choose another day to hold the inauguration ceremony. Humph. I hope that you won't be unable to take out the powerful magical weapon of the sect at that time." After that, she looked away from Zi Yuan and cast her eyes on Li Yundong. She took a deep look at the man and then at Ao Wushuang with hatred. Finally, she turned her face with a complicated expression and whispered to Zhou Ping, "Let's go." Zhou Ping was stunned. "But, Master." Zhang Ling tilted her head slightly and said unhappily, "Didn't you hear what I said?" Zhou Ping's heart tightened. She didn't dare to say anything more. She lowered her head and followed Zhang Ling away. As soon as Zhang Ling left, the people of the Xueqi school also left one after another. For a moment, the mountain was empty. Deng Yu and Deng Jiao looked back at Li Yundong with every step they took. They wanted to go forward and say a few words to Li Yundong. They didn't want to say too many words. They just wanted this man to know that they were not dead and that they were living a good life in Mount Longhu. But at this time, Li Yundong was unconscious. They wanted to go forward and care about him, but he was surrounded by Su Chan, Zi Yuan, and Zhou Qin, and Ao Wushuang was standing next to him. The two of them were shy girls, so how could they have the nerve to get close to these stunning beauties? Some of them were Li Yundong's girlfriends, some were his confidants, and some were his disciples. Even the most distant ones were Li Yundong's fellow disciples or friends. But what about them? At this moment, Deng Yu and Deng Jiao's thoughts were tangled. What am I? Am I just a poor little girl who looks at the hero in my heart from afar and has a crush on him? The sisters had the same thought. They sighed together, turned around, and left with Zhang Ling and the others. When Zhang Lufang saw them turn around and leave, she said something to Zhang Kongyun and quickly chased after them. But after taking a few steps, she suddenly found that there seemed to be someone missing from her side. She looked back and saw Hardadef standing there in a daze, motionless like a clay puppet. She quickly ran back to look at Hardadef and asked curiously, "Hardadef, what's wrong with you? Why are you in a daze here?" Hardadef pursed his lips tightly, clenched his fists, and trembled slightly. He turned his face, and a strange light shone in his blue eyes. He said in a low voice, "I want to cultivate." Zhang Lufang was stunned. "What?" Hardadef then repeated in a firm voice, "I said, I want to cultivate." Zhang Lufang giggled. "What's the matter? Have you been touched by Invincible Li's prestige? Well, I'm looking forward to seeing how far you can go. However, if you want to cultivate, you have to go to my master. What's the use of telling me?" Without saying a word, Hardadef rushed to Zhang Kongyun, knelt down with a thud, kowtowed heavily, and said resolutely, "Master, I want to cultivate." As he spoke, he raised his head, and his eyes were warm and firm. There was no sign of his usual naivety. Zhang Kongyun was silent for a while. He raised his hand, helped him up, and patted him on the shoulder. He didn't say a word, but his eyes softened a lot. He turned around and waved his hand, motioning for him to follow behind him. Seeing him leave, Hardadef thought that he wouldn't agree, so he hurriedly knelt down and kowtowed again. However, Zhang Lufang gently kicked him and whispered, "Idiot, master promised you. Hurry up and keep up." As if waking up from a dream, Hardadef hurriedly followed. Just as Zhang Kongyun was about to leave the temple with Hardadef and Zhang Lufang, he suddenly heard Ao Wushuang shouting behind him, "Zhang Kongyun, tell me, Wang Yuanshanj. Is he still alive?" Zhang Kongyun stopped and said without looking back, "He died a long time ago." After that, he quickly walked away and gradually disappeared into the mountain path. Zhang Kongyun was silent all the way. After leaving the side peak with Zhang Lufang and the others, he suddenly turned to Zhang Lufang and said, "Take him back first. I'll go somewhere else." Zhang Lufang knew that her master had lost the battle today, so he must be in a bad mood. She nodded obediently and said with concern, "Master, come back soon." A smile appeared on Zhang Kongyun's old face, and he nodded gently. After watching Zhang Kongyun and Hardadef leave, he walked to a side peak. After he walked up the mountain, he came to a huge rock on the top of the mountain with a Fengchen stone engraved on it. He stood quietly for a long time before he slowly said, "You taught Li Jiandong how to stop bleeding, didn't you? Only you know this kind of technique. Since you were locked up here 10 years ago, no one in the cultivation world has used this technique." As he spoke, a man suddenly appeared behind him. This man was wearing a Taoist robe. He was handsome and elegant like an immortal. At first glance, he looked like a man in his 30s, especially his eyes, which were deep and experienced, as if he had seen through everything in the world. He smiled gently and said, "So what if I did? So what if I didn't?" Zhang Kongyun was silent for a while, then said, "Your old lover is here. Don't you want to go down the mountain to see her?" The man lowered his eyes slightly. After a long time, he raised them and sighed softly. "It's better not to see her." Zhang Kongyun turned his head to look at him and chuckled. "It's been 10 years, but you still haven't forgotten her. You still hate us. Are you happy to see me suffer a crushing defeat this time?" The man said in a low voice, "A great disaster is coming. How can I have the time to watch you make a fool of yourself?" Zhang Kongyun seemed to know what the great disaster he was talking about was. He suddenly asked, "Why didn't you take action? If you had taken action, the Xueqi school would not have suffered such humiliation." The man smiled slightly and said, "Whether it's the Xueqi school or the Zhenger school, what does it have to do with me? However, your leader, Zhanren Zhang, was able to resist coming out of seclusion. I really admire him. He is indeed a good cultivator who is indifferent to fame and fortune." Zhang Kongyun stared at him closely. After a long time he said, "The cultivation world is about to be in chaos. I want to see how long you can be free and unfettered." With that, he snorted and left in a huff. The man's eyes revealed a hint of a smile as he looked at the man's back. He suddenly raised his voice and said, "You are the ones who locked me up here, and now you are saying such things. Could it be that you want to take all the good and bad people in this world as your own?" Zhang Kongyun stopped and glared at him angrily. Then, he quickened his pace and left quickly. The man looked at his figure and couldn't help laughing. But after laughing for a while, he suddenly looked in the direction of Ao Wushuang and said softly, "Wushuang, I haven't seen you for 10 years. How are you?" Chapter 7:18. The earth-shattering battle finally came to an end. There were few people on the mountain, which had been crowded with people. Except for Lu Chunping, who had been in a daze by the side of the Taoist sanctum, there were only Li Jiandong, Su Chan, Zi Yuan, Zhou Qin, Ao Wushuang, and the others left. Ao Wushuang looked in the direction where Zhang Kongyun had left. After a long time, Su Chan walked gently to her side and said in a low voice, "Master, let's go back." Ao Wushuang turned her head. Her cold and strong face was full of heartbreaking sadness and unwillingness. She whispered, "Chaner, do you think Wang Yuanshan is dead?" Su Chan had never seen her strong and resolute master show such a weak side. She couldn't bear it and gently persuaded, "Master, I think Wang Yuanshan should still be alive." Although Ao Wushuang knew that Su Chan was comforting her, her eyes still lit up and she quickly asked, "If he is alive, why didn't he come to me?" Su Chan blinked and said, "Maybe he has his own difficulties?" Ao Wushuang grabbed her arm and said anxiously, "What difficulties does he have? Is there anything more important than me?" Su Chan felt a pain in her arm. She couldn't help but cry out, "Master, it hurts." Only then did Ao Wushuang wake up. She let go of her hand in disappointment and despair. She smiled sadly and said softly, "I know you are comforting me. After so many years, he has never come to find me. If he is still here, he will definitely come to find me. If he doesn't come, then there can only be one result. I should have expected it, I should have stopped holding out hope." As she said this, 2 lines of tears slowly flowed down Ao Wushuang's cheeks. Not far away, Zi Yuan and Zhou Qin looked at each other and were silent. In their impression, Ao Wushuang was a strong, indifferent, gorgeous, and strong woman. But under her hard shell, there was a hot and weak heart. At this moment, she was no different from a weak and helpless little girl. Su Chan gently wiped away Ao Wushuang's tears. She chuckled and said, "Master, even if Wang Yuanshan has ascended, maybe one day you will also become an immortal. Won't you be able to see him again?" Ao Wushuang stared at Su Chan with a gentle look in her eyes. "Silly child, since the Tang dynasty, no fox spirit has become an immortal. Don't be silly. Even if Ao Wushuang reaches the realm of a 9-tailed celestial fox, she still can't become an immortal." Su Chan asked curiously, "Why not?" Ao Wushuang gently stroked Su Chan's cheek and said softly, "Because the immortals in heaven don't accept us, and the people on earth don't accept us either. We are a group of monsters who don't care about heaven and earth." Su Chan was not convinced. "No, Yundong will take care of me. I don't care whether others take care of me or not." Ao Wushuang chuckled and looked at Su Chan as if she had a lot to say, but when the words were about to come out of her mouth, she glanced at Li Yundong, who was unconscious not far away, and changed her mind. "Forget it. Let's go back first. Li Yundong's injury is more important." Su Chan nodded obediently, and the group turned and walked down the mountain. After a fierce battle, the dark clouds that had originally shrouded Mount Longhu disappeared. The blue sky was clear and boundless. Even from a distance, Su Chan and the others could see that there were many tourists on the main peak of Mount Longhu looking at them. They didn't dare to fly. After going down the mountain, they walked a long way before flying back to Tiannan City with Li Yundong. As soon as he returned home, the little foxes, who had been waiting anxiously for news, swarmed around him, chattering and asking questions. Especially when they saw Li Yundong, who was unconscious, they suddenly turned pale with fright and surrounded him tightly. Fortunately, Su Chan put her hands on her hips and scolded them, which drove the little foxes away. Chris, who was next to her, also looked at the seriously injured Li Yundong in surprise. She wanted to ask something, but she didn't know how to say it, so she could only watch with concern. After Su Chan, Zi Yuan, and the others placed Li Yundong in his room, Zi Yuan treated his wounds, and everyone breathed a sigh of relief. Zi Yuan looked at Su Chan and then at Zhou Qin, and then said softly, Su Chan, take care of Li Yundong. Zhou Qin, you have to be careful that the higher-ups will make trouble for you. This time, the impact of the battle is very big, and it's very bad. You have to be careful. Zhou Qin nodded. Don't worry, I've already thought about what to do. It'll be fine. Zi Yuan smiled slightly and said softly, that's good. Li Yundong is really lucky to have a disciple like you. Zhou Qin looked at her with a complicated look in her eyes and said softly, it's a real blessing for me to have a master like Li Yundong. Moreover, it's his fortune to have a confidant like you. Zi Yuan's heart trembled slightly. She couldn't help but quickly glance at Su Chan, only to see that she was looking at the unconscious Li Yundong in a daze, as if she hadn't heard such a sentence. Zi Yuan breathed a sigh of relief in her heart. She smiled, didn't answer, and walked out of the door. Zhou Qin looked at Li Yundong quietly in the room for a while. After a long time, she sighed softly and also went out. Su Chan looked at Li Yundong quietly in the room, her eyes flashing. The little girl felt extremely guilty now. She couldn't help in the battle, but just now, she had almost worsened Li Yundong's injury. This was too much. Even the little girl couldn't forgive herself. How could I be so stupid? Su Chan hit her head in annoyance. She looked at Li Yundong with a sad face and pouted her little mouth. She thought dejectedly in her heart, Yundong must hate me. I almost killed him. Su Chan stared at Li Yundong's face with infatuation. Her eyes moved from his thick eyebrows to his tall nose, and then to the corners of his mouth. The girl couldn't help but be fascinated by him for a moment. She stared at his face for a while, then at the corners of his mouth. Since the first day she had decided to be with him, since she had decided to grow up with him, although the little girl had expected that he would become a very great cultivator and a great hero in the future, she had never expected that he would become a great cultivator and a great hero. But she really hadn't thought that Li Yundong could become so strong that he could almost destroy the entire Japanese cultivation world by himself, and make the Japanese cultivation world have to abide by the promise that as long as Li Yundong was in China, they would not set foot in China. From now on, Invincible Li would be truly invincible. The cultivators of all sects would no longer have any doubts about Li Yundong's strength. In the future, wherever they went, they would point at Li Yundong from afar and say, look, this is Invincible Li. And what about her? In the future, if she stayed by his side, they would point at her and say, look, that's the troublemaker around Li Yundong, just like, they look at my master. Wang Yuanshan and my master were forced to separate. So what about me? Will I be forced to separate from Li Yundong in the future? If I don't become stronger, will the tragedy that happened to my master and Wang Yuanshan repeat itself? When she had seen Li Yundong fall twice on Mount Longhu, Su Chan had really felt a wave of fear and oppression from the depths of her soul. She couldn't imagine how she would survive without Li Yundong by her side in the future. No, I can't let what happened to my master happen to me. Su Chan clenched her fists, and her eyes showed a strong and firm look. She whispered, you have to become stronger, Su Chan. You can't be a burden to Yundong. As soon as she finished speaking, she heard a soft voice say, silly girl, do you finally want to work hard to become stronger? Su Chan was shocked. She looked up and saw Li Yundong standing on the bed, looking at her gently. The little girl was surprised and said, Yundong, you're awake? How's your injury? The little girl looked at Li Yundong's chest, only to see that it was intact, as if there was no injury. She was tongue-tied and said, your injury has healed? That's impossible, isn't it? Li Yundong couldn't help laughing. He pointed down and said, look down. The little girl looked down and saw that Li Yundong was still lying on the bed, his chest wrapped in gauze that was soaked with red blood. Su Chan was stunned. Two Yundongs? But then she quickly reacted and said, Oh, your young spirit is out of your body. Li Yundong laughed and sat on the edge of the bed. He reached out and touched the tip of the little girl's nose. You're not stupid. Su Chan pouted and lowered her head. She took Li Yundong's hand and said in a low voice, I'm sorry, I'm so stupid. I couldn't help you, and I almost made your injury worse. Li Yundong looked at Su Chan lovingly and laughed. Silly girl. You're just a little excited. Besides, people will grow up slowly, but you are very slow. At first, Su Chan was a little relieved, but when she heard the last sentence, her face suddenly fell. She said bitterly, well, I know I'm stupid. Don't hit me all the time, or I'll really become stupid. Li Yundong saw that the little girl was full of self-pity and self-blame, so he laughed and said, I'm just teasing you. You're the type of person who matures slowly, okay? Su Chan wrinkled her little nose and made a face at Li Yundong. You're so annoying. I don't want to be the type of person who matures slowly. Li Yundong looked at Su Chan with a smile and suddenly whispered to her, Do you want to become a master immediately? Su Chan nodded without hesitation. Of course, I can't help you with anything. I'm very sad. Li Yundong laughed wickedly, hugged Su Chan, and said with a smile, Well, you also know that I'm a Jinshin master now. Do you remember what you said? Su Chan looked up at Li Yundong and blinked. At first, she didn't react, but soon she cried out. Her face was red, and she shyly buried her head in Li Yundong's chest and said angrily, You're so annoying. You only remember this. You're so bad. Li Yundong said with a straight face, The way of dual cultivation is a family, and the ceremony of husband and wife is a big ceremony. Haven't you heard of it? Su Chan smiled and said, Bah, what big ceremony? Is doing this kind of thing also a big ceremony? Li Yundong said seriously, You little girl, did all the books you studied before go to waste? Don't you know that this kind of thing is called a big ceremony? Su Chan scratched her cheeks and giggled. Shame on you. This is obviously a derivative meaning. How can you take it so seriously? Li Yundong grabbed her wrist and said with a coquettish face, Chaner, don't you want to do this big ceremony with me? Su Chan's ears were so embarrassed that they almost bled. She chuckled and lowered her head. The corners of her eyes were flowing, and she giggled and said, I called you invincible Li. If I see you like this, won't I laugh myself to death? Li Yundong smiled and said, When I fainted, I thought of you for a moment. I was thinking, if one day I'm gone, what will you do? If I die one day and don't have a day of warmth with my girl, then I will have lived my life in vain. Su Chan was shocked when she heard this. She quickly reached out and pressed her hand against Li Yundong's lips, saying nervously, Don't talk nonsense. You can't say such things casually. Li Yundong gently picked up Su Chan's soft hand and kissed it. He said softly, If I hadn't met you, I would have lived a muddle-headed life. But God let me meet you, so I won't let my life be in vain. 10,000 years is too long. I have to seize every moment, right? Su Chan felt warm in her heart when she heard this. She gently stroked Li Yundong's lips and cheeks with her hand. The little girl's face was blushing. She whispered, Yundong Chaner is all yours. She also wants to be with you. It's just that your injury hasn't healed yet. When your injury is healed, we can't. Okay. Li Yundong looked at Su Chan's shy appearance and laughed in his heart. Suddenly he said in surprise, Of course I have to wait until my injury is healed. There's a big hole in my body, so I can't condense the power of Jinshin, so my young spirit is only in the young spirit realm. If I have sex with you, won't I be sucked to death by you? As he said this, he shook his head and sighed. I didn't expect you to be even more anxious than me. Su Chan was embarrassed. She stamped her feet and said angrily, You're so annoying. You're messing with me. The two of them laughed for a while. Su Chan lay lazily in Li Yundong's arms. Although her face was full of happy smiles, Li Yundong was keenly aware of a trace of worry and melancholy hidden deep in Su Chan's eyes. Li Yundong's heart skipped a beat. He suddenly smiled and said, Come with me, your young spirit. I'll take you somewhere. Su Chan asked curiously, Where are we going? Li Yundong smiled slightly. Let's go find Wang Yuanshan. Chapter 719. Su Chan looked at Li Yundong in surprise and said, Yundong, why do you want to find Wang Yuanshan now? Isn't he already dead? Li Yundong smiled slightly and said, No, he shouldn't be dead, and he should be in Mount Longhu. I'll be there soon. Su Chan's eyes widened. No way? Wang Yuanshan is not dead? How do you know? Li Yundong smiled and said, Do you remember that I sealed the acupoints on my body to stop the wound? That was told to me by a voice transmission. Moreover, I remember that Zi Yuan once said that only the cultivators of the Linggong sect are good at using voice transmission. Who do you think the person who sent me the voice transmission was? Su Chan exclaimed, I have to tell Master as soon as possible. Li Yundong quickly grabbed her and said, Silly, let's go and have a look first. What if I'm wrong? Your master can't bear this kind of disappointment anymore. Su Chan nodded and looked at Li Yundong with admiration. Yundong, you are so thoughtful. Shall we go now? Li Yundong nodded and looked at Li Yundong with admiration. As she spoke, she looked at Li Yundong's body and said softly, Now that your young spirit is out of your body, will it affect the recovery of your injury? Li Yundong laughed and said, No, my qi and blood are running automatically in my body and recovering on their own. Zi Yuan poured so many elixirs on my wound before. Do you think it was all for nothing? Li Yundong patted Su Chan's head and said softly, Let's go to Mount Longhu to have a look. Su Chan rolled her eyes. Just as she was about to speak, she suddenly felt a familiar aura quickly leaving the house and heading into the distance. Su Chan was very familiar with this aura. It was the aura of Ao Wushuang. Su Chan was stunned and then asked curiously, Where is Master going? Li Yundong was also stunned for a moment. The direction she's going seems to be Mount Longhu? Su Chan said in surprise, It must be that Master is unwilling to give up, so she wants to go to Mount Longhu to have a look. She won't be in trouble, will she? Li Yunyang thought for a while and said, After the battle, although the Zhengyi school did not lose many people, there will definitely be a period of relaxation. The defense should not be very strict. Moreover, with Ao Wushuang's strength, she should be fine. However, we can't be too careless. We'll follow them to take a look, but don't let your physical body follow them. Otherwise, if something happens, it'll be inconvenient for you to escape. Su Chan giggled. You're the world-famous Li Wudi now. Will you be chased away by others? Li Yundong smiled and said, There is no such thing as absolute invincibility. My physical body is very weak now, and the power of my young spirit has also decreased a lot. Besides, Mount Longhu is not a playground. I can go and leave as I please. If something happens, it will be hard to say. Su Chan nodded and said with a smile, My young spirit is stronger than yours now. Maybe I'll have to protect you in the end. Li Yundong laughed and said, Well, I'm looking forward to it. The two of them chatted and laughed, and the young spirit quickly chased after Ao Wushuang. The two of them followed Ao Wushuang from afar for a while, and saw that she was flying in the direction of Jiangxi. After waiting for a long time, the two of them saw that the mountains under their feet were continuous, with green mountains and blue waters. They were vast and winding, like a crouching dragon. Li Yundong smiled slightly and said with some emotion, I didn't expect to return to Mount Longhu so soon. Let's go down. Su Chan nodded. She looked around and felt that Ao Wushuang had landed on a side peak, so she stopped. She pulled Li Yundong's hand and whispered, Master is over there. Do you want to go and have a look? Li Yundong nodded and landed on the ground with Su Chan. The two of them looked over and saw that on the top of a side peak, Ao Wushuang was standing in front of a huge rock. Her back was to the two of them. Although her expression could not be seen, Li Yundong could tell from the way she gently stroked the rock that her heart must be full of sorrow at this time. Ao Wushuang stroked the rock and muttered to herself in a low voice, Yuanshan, are you really still alive? If you were still alive, why didn't you come to see me? Do you know how much I've missed you in the past 10 years? Do you have the heart to watch me live alone in the world? At this time, Ao Wushuang's voice was bitter and mellow, like a dreamer whispering her thoughts to her lover. In the distance, Li Yundong and Su Chan sighed in their hearts when they heard this. Su Chan's eyes were red, and she couldn't help but want to cry. She unconsciously held Li Yundong tightly with both hands, as if she was afraid that he would run away in the next second. The two of them quietly listened to Ao Wushuang whisper to the huge rock about the little things she had done with Wang Yuanshan. They listened to her talk about her previous happiness, as well as the pain and sadness when she was lonely. For a moment, the two of them seemed to be in a daze. Soon, Ao Wushuang spoke in a low voice. No one knew how long it had been, but her tears had already formed. Tears rolled down her beautiful face. She cried in a low voice for a long time before she let out a long sigh and said in a choked voice, "Yuanshan, if you are still in this world, you must come to me. You must remember." As she said this, she suddenly raised her head and shouted, "Wang Yuanshan, you must come to me." Ao Wushuang's shout shook the sky and echoed between the valleys of Mount Longhu. Li Yundong and Su Chan were so shocked that their faces turned a little pale. They looked at each other, and Su Chan stammered, "Master, is she crazy? Isn't she afraid of attracting the other people of the Xueqi school?" Li Yundong also said with a solemn face, "Oh no. Your master, she seems to have the will to die." Su Chan was startled. "What do you mean?" Li Yundong said in a deep voice, "There are two purposes for your master to shout. First, if Wang Yuanshan is still here, he will definitely be able to hear this shout, and the other people of the Xueqi school will also be able to hear it. At this time, the other people of the Xueqi school will definitely come to make trouble for your master. If Wang Yuanshan doesn't show up at this time, your master will definitely think that he is indeed dead. If so, she will die with the others of the Xueqi school. If Wang Yuanshan is not dead, he should show up to save Ao Wushuang." Su Chan was shocked and hurriedly said, "Yundong, hurry up and help my master." Li Yundong smiled bitterly. "Me? I'm at best a young spirit master now. I'm not as good as you in fighting. How can I help?" Su Chan said anxiously, "What should we do?" Li Yundong patted her head and said softly, "Let's wait and see. Wang Yuanshan should show up." But what surprised Li Yundong and Su Chan was that after Ao Wushuang's shout, not only did Wang Yuanshan not show up, but none of the other people of the Xueqi school showed up. What's going on? Li Yundong and Su Chan looked at each other. Li Yundong was tongue-tied. Su Chan also asked curiously, "Why didn't anyone come?" Li Yundong had a strange look on his face. "I don't know, but it seems to be a good thing." Su Chan's face was full of joy. "Anyway, as long as my master is fine." At this time, the two of them couldn't help looking at Ao Wushuang, only to see that Ao Wushuang's face, which was full of hope, slowly became lonely and sad, and finally lowered her head in despair. Ao Wushuang stood there in a daze, motionless as if she had been petrified. After a long time, she slowly moved. Her footsteps were as heavy as lead. She walked down the mountain step by step until her figure disappeared into the jungle. She never looked back. Li Yundong sighed with emotion. Su Chan, who was beside him, seemed to empathize with him. Tears kept welling up in her eyes, and she snuggled up to Li Yundong with tears in her eyes. She whispered, "Yundong, I'm so sad. Why didn't Wang Yuanshan show up?" Li Yundong sighed softly and said, "Maybe he is really not in this world anymore?" Su Chan held Li Yundong's arm and pressed her face against his chest. She looked at the direction in which Ao Wushuang had left and said in a low voice, "Why didn't the people of Xueqi school come?" Li Yundong also felt strange in his heart. He turned to look at the main peak of Xueqi school and shook his head. "I don't know, but this matter is very strange." Su Chan suddenly looked up and asked, "Shall we go and see what's going on?" Li Yundong thought for a moment and nodded. "Okay, let's mix in the crowd of tourists and have a look. Don't cause any trouble." After the two of them came to an agreement, they quickly rushed toward the main peak. However, as they ran, they did not see a single Taoist priest. Especially when they arrived at the front of the Taoist rite on the main peak, they realized that there were only a few Taoist priests of higher seniority who were socializing around the scenic spots. The others were extremely young and of extremely low seniority. Li Yundong glanced around and felt a little strange. But suddenly, a Taoist priest rushed to a senior Taoist priest and whispered something in his ear. The Taoist priest's face changed greatly. He immediately winked at the Taoist priests around him and then walked down the mountain quietly. Li Yundong looked back and winked at Su Chan, and the two of them quickly followed. They saw these Taoist priests go down the mountain and get out of the sight of the secular people. They quickly flew toward a side peak. The two of them followed them from a distance. When they arrived at a side peak, they found that these Taoist priests had gone into a very hidden Taoist rite. Li Yundong and Su Chan looked at each other and didn't dare to follow them in. Instead, they chose to choose a high place and looked at it from a high place. At a glance, they saw that the Taoist rite was very large, even larger than the one held by the Xueqi school for the succession ceremony of the Linggong sect. In the field, a group of Taoist priests in gray Taoist robes were confronting Zhang Ling, Zhang Kongyun, and the others of the Xueqi school. There was a lot of noise on both sides, and the atmosphere was tense. Su Chan said curiously, "It's so strange. Are they having an internal strife?" Li Yundong said curiously, "Could it be that they are having an internal strife right after the inauguration ceremony of the Linggong sect? That's impossible. Hey no! Among these Taoist priests, why are there so many foreign devils?" The two of them took a closer look and saw that many of the Taoist priests in gray robes had deep eyes, high noses and golden blue eyes. Su Chan was dumbfounded. Which sect is this? Li Yundong also felt a little incredulous. Just as he was about to speak, he suddenly heard the sound of music coming from the mountain road below, and there were people shouting in unison. But when they got closer, they understood that it was actually someone playing the suona, beating the alms bowl, and some people were shouting in unison, "Sect leader Wu Hua, supernatural power is connected to the gods, in the heavens and on the earth, only I am supreme." When Li Yundong heard this, he almost fainted. He looked at the group of people in shock and said, "Damn it, no way. When did Zhang Yuan become the constellation immortal? Did he watch too many demigods and semi-devils?" Su Chan heard these people shouting at the top of their lungs. Their voices were loud, but the content was a little funny. She wanted to laugh but didn't dare to. She could only hold back her laughter and said, "What the hell is this old guy doing?" The two of them widened their eyes as they looked at the group of people, only to see that they were dressed in all sorts of ways. The people at the front were playing and singing, while the people at the back were holding banners and shouting loudly. Among them, a few strong men were carrying a wooden platform, on which sat a beautiful and charming woman. Li Yundong was shocked when he saw the woman. He stammered, "Damn it, this is Ding Nan. What the hell is going on? Did she take the wrong medicine?" You're tuning in to the Xueqi's Martial Arts Saga YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.